Take off that cheap jewelry right now. The judge ordered, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. He pointed directly at the Navy cross pinned to my uniform. Beside him, my sister-in-law Naomi let out a quiet, satisfied smirk. She thought she had finally won. She thought stripping away my dignity would give her total control over my life and my fortune. I did not scream or argue. I kept my eyes locked on the judge, unpinned the heavy metal, and placed it onto the wooden table with a sharp clack. Neither of them knew that the sound of that metal hitting the wood was the exact signal that would end his career and send her to federal prison. My name is Riley, and at 33 years old, I found myself fighting a war against my own flesh and blood. Before I tell you how a supposed family dinner turned into a hostile takeover, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against toxic relatives who tried to steal your success. Trust me, you will want to hear how I dismantled their entire operation. The nightmare began exactly 1 month before that courtroom showdown. I had just returned to Connecticut after a grueling 6-month cybersecurity deployment overseas. I was exhausted, jet-lagged, but genuinely excited to see my family. I had purchased expensive gifts for everyone during my travels, hoping to celebrate my safe return. I bought a vintage silk scarf for my mother Patricia, a rare bottle of scotch for my father Richard, and even a designer handbag for my brother David and his wife Naomi. I pulled up to my parents' house, a large, pristine property that always projected the perfect suburban illusion. I walked up the driveway with my arms full of wrapped boxes, anticipating the smell of a home-cooked welcome dinner and the warm embrace of my family. I pushed open the front door with a smile, calling out a cheerful greeting. But the house was completely silent. There was no smell of roasting chicken or baking pie. The dining table was bare, stripped of its usual holiday tablecloth. Instead, my parents were sitting stiffly on the living room sofa, their faces drawn and serious. David sat beside them, looking down at his shoes, avoiding my gaze. And standing in the center of the room, arms crossed over her chest, was Naomi. My 30-year-old African-American sister-in-law was dressed head to toe in designer brands, though I knew for a fact she and David were drowning in credit card debt. She did not offer a greeting. She did not ask about my flight or my deployment. Instead, she picked up a thick stack of legal documents from the coffee table and slammed them down right in front of me. "What is this?" I asked, my smile faltering as I set the gift boxes down on the floor. I looked at my parents, waiting for an explanation, but Richard and Patricia found the pattern of the rug fascinating. Naomi took a step forward, her chin raised in defiance. "Those are court filings, Riley," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "We are filing for an emergency conservatorship over you." The words did not make sense. I stared at the papers, my mind struggling to process the dense legal jargon printed on the first page. "Conservatorship," I repeated, genuinely confused by the absurdity of her statement. "I run my own cybersecurity firm. I just completed a high-level military contract. What are you talking about?" Naomi let out a theatrical sigh, glancing at my parents as if I were a lost child who could not comprehend basic reality. "You are not well, Riley," she continued, her tone patronizing. "You have been isolated. You make irrational financial decisions. We are stepping in to take control of your assets for your own protection." The irrational financial decision she was referring to was my recent purchase of a $2.5 million historic estate. It was a massive, beautiful property that I had bought with my own hard-earned money right before my deployment. I had planned to fully restore it to make it my permanent sanctuary. Naomi had been consumed with jealousy when I closed the deal. She had spent weeks dropping hints about how a single woman with no husband and no children did not need that much space. Now she was making her boldest move yet. "As your appointed conservators, David and I will move into the estate to manage the property," Naomi announced, crossing her arms again. "We will take over your banking accounts and make sure your bills are paid. You will get a weekly allowance, of course. We just want to make sure you are safe." I felt a knot form in my stomach as the reality of their ambush set in. They did not want to help me. They wanted to steal my home and my money under the guise of family care. I turned to my parents, my voice rising. I expected them to defend me to shut this down immediately. Instead, my mother looked away, and my father cleared his throat nervously. Are you seriously going to sit there and let her do this? You know I am perfectly capable of managing my own life. I do not need babysitters, and I certainly do not need a conservator. That is when Naomi delivered the final devastating blow. She reached into the folder and pulled out a piece of paper that looked suspiciously like a medical file. Actually, she said, a cruel smile playing on her lips, the court disagrees with you. We have submitted documentation proving that your severe military PTSD makes you a danger to yourself and others. You are legally incompetent, Riley, and by tomorrow morning, everything you own will belong to us. I stared at Naomi, taking in the absolute audacity of her statement. My eyes moved past her expensive designer outfit and landed squarely on my mother and father. I waited for the punchline. I waited for Richard and Patricia to burst out laughing to tell Naomi she had gone too far with this sick joke. Instead, my mother Patricia adjusted her posture and looked at me with an expression of manufactured pity. Riley, honey, she began, her voice adopting the soothing tone one might use to placate a frightened animal. You have to understand how worried we have been about you. You came back from your last deployment so changed. You do not talk to us the way you used to. You lock yourself away in that huge house all alone. It is just not healthy for a young woman to isolate herself with so much trauma. Trauma, I snapped, taking a step forward. Mom, I work in cybersecurity. I sit behind a highly classified terminal protecting digital infrastructure. I am not wandering the streets having flashbacks. I just bought a house. That is called making an investment, not losing my mind. My father Richard finally spoke up, his voice stern and commanding, the way it always was when he was trying to force me to yield to his demands. Do not raise your voice to your mother, Riley. We are doing this because we love you. That estate is a massive undertaking. You have absolutely no business trying to manage a property of that magnitude in your current mental state. Giving David and Naomi legal authority to oversee the property and your finances is the safest option for everyone. They can maintain the estate properly, while you focus on getting the psychiatric help you desperately need. I looked at David, my 31-year-old brother, who was actively shrinking into the sofa cushions. David had always been the undeniable golden child of the family. From the time we were kids, the rules never applied to him. When I got straight A's, my parents told me to study harder. When David barely scraped by with C's, they bought him a new car to celebrate his effort. But looking at him now, a grown man, hiding behind his wife and our aging parents, the reality of their sickening dynamic clicked into sharp focus. Safest for who? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Safest for me, or safest for David? Naomi crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets clinking together. We are your family, Riley. We are simply stepping up to handle the burdens you cannot carry. You should be thanking us instead of acting so hostile. Your hostility right now only proves our point. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. The utter hypocrisy was suffocating. I pointed directly at David. The burdens I cannot carry. Let us talk about carrying burdens, David. While I was deployed overseas running covert digital operations to earn my Navy Cross, you were busy bankrupting your third startup company in 5 years. What was the last one again? A luxury pet grooming app. You lasted exactly 4 months before the creditors started calling. Keep your brother out of this! Patricia scolded, her face flushing bright red. David has an entrepreneurial spirit. He just has not found the right market fit yet. Entrepreneurial spirit. I echoed, unable to contain my disgust. Mom, you and Dad have been draining your retirement accounts to fund his entrepreneurial spirit for a decade. Do you think I do not know? I work in digital intelligence. I know exactly how many times you have remortgaged this house to pay off his gambling debts and cover Naomi's endless shopping sprees. You two are practically broke because you refuse to cut the cord on your golden child. Richard stood up fast, his fists clenched at his sides. That is enough, Riley. Your financial jealousy has always been your worst trait. We support your brother because he has a family to care for. Naomi is pregnant. They need stability. They need a proper home to raise our grandchild. And there it was. The ugly, naked truth laid bare in the middle of the living room. This had absolutely nothing to do with my mental health or any fabricated PTSD diagnosis. This was a calculated real estate heist. My brother and his wife had driven themselves into a massive hole of debt, and my parents had run out of retirement funds to bail them out. So they looked at my success, my carefully saved money, and my newly purchased $2.5 million historic estate, and decided to simply take it. They were willing to strip away my basic human rights, brand me legally incompetent, and ruin my reputation just to secure a free luxury mansion for their golden child. Naomi tapped the legal documents on the coffee table, her smirk returning. The paperwork is already filed, Riley. The temporary order is in place. If you just sign this consent form right now, acknowledging that you need help, we can make this easy. We will put you up in a nice, quiet apartment. You can get therapy. You will not have to worry about paying bills or managing anything ever again. If you fight us, the court will just force you anyway, and it will be humiliating for you. The sheer audacity of her threat hung in the quiet room. My parents watched me with expectant eyes, waiting for me to break. They were so used to me being the compliant daughter, the one who always tried to earn their love by being easy and low maintenance. They fully expected me to cave under the pressure of their united front, to surrender my life to keep the peace. They genuinely believed I would roll over and hand my hard-earned estate to a 31-year-old man-child and his greedy wife. Instead, I reached down and picked up the expensive gifts I had carefully wrapped for them. I held the vintage silk scarf, the rare scotch, and the designer handbag in my arms. I looked at the people who were supposed to protect me, the people who shared my blood. I realized in that exact moment that the family I thought I had never actually existed. They were just parasites waiting for a host to feed on. You are right about one thing, Mom, I said, my voice completely steady, devoid of any emotion. I am definitely making a major change in my life starting right now. My father looked relieved, assuming I was giving in. Good. You are finally being reasonable, Riley. Just sign the papers and we can move forward as a family. I am not signing anything, I replied, staring dead into his eyes. And we are no longer a family. You want to play a legal game to steal my home. Fine. But understand this clearly. You have picked a fight with a woman who dismantles hostile organizations for a living. You have no idea what kind of war you just started. I turned on my heel, carrying the gifts with me. I did not look back as Naomi yelled that I was acting crazy. I did not stop when my mother commanded me to come back to the living room. I walked straight out the front door, letting it slam shut behind me, severing my relationship with my family on the spot. I marched to my car, threw the gifts into the trunk, and slammed it shut with a satisfying thud. The cool night air hit my face as I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tight. I had just lost my parents and my brother in a single brutal instant. But as I started the engine, I knew I could not afford to mourn them yet. I had to secure my defenses before Naomi could do any more damage. I pulled out of the driveway and sped down the dark suburban street, leaving my past entirely behind me. The tires of my car gripped the asphalt as I put miles between myself and the house I grew up in. My mind raced through the implications of Naomi throwing those legal documents onto the coffee table. As a cybersecurity expert, I am trained to anticipate attacks, identify vulnerabilities, and neutralize threats before they completely compromise a system. But this was a completely different kind of breach. This was a social engineering attack executed by the people who had brought me into the world. My fuel light illuminated on the dashboard, snapping me back to immediate reality. I pulled into a brightly lit gas station just off the interstate, seeking a brief moment of normalcy to gather my scattered thoughts and refuel my car. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, grabbed the heavy fuel nozzle, and slid my primary civilian credit card into the reader. The digital screen flashed processing for a few agonizing seconds before a harsh red message popped up stating the transaction was declined. I frowned, pulling the card out and briskly wiping the magnetic strip against my jacket. I had a credit limit on that specific card that could buy a luxury car outright, so a simple tank of gas should not have triggered any fraud alerts. I inserted the card a second time. Declined. A cold prickle of unease started to crawl up the back of my neck. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a different card, a premium travel reward card linked to a completely different banking institution. I swiped it through the machine. Declined. Please contact your financial institution. The cold prickle turned into a sudden rushing wave of genuine alarm. I abandoned the gas pump and locked myself back inside my car, pulling out my smartphone with trembling hands. My fingers flew across the screen as I opened my primary banking application. The biometric scanner authenticated my face and the dashboard loaded slowly. My checking account balance, which normally displayed a comfortable six-figure sum from my recent contracting work, showed a terrifying zero. A bright yellow alert banner dominated the top of the screen. It stated that all funds had been frozen and restricted pending a court-ordered mandate. My breath caught in my throat as panic threatened to overtake my logic. I quickly cycled through my other financial applications. My high-yield savings account was locked. My civilian investment portfolios were completely frozen, preventing any transfers or withdrawals. Even the small local credit union account I used strictly for automatic utility payments had a restrictive hold placed on it. I stared at the glowing screens in the dark cabin of my car, the horrifying truth washing over me in waves. Naomi had not just threatened me with a stack of papers at a family dinner. She had already executed the strike. She had filed the emergency conservatorship paperwork days, or maybe even weeks before I ever stepped foot off that airplane. The legal system moves notoriously slow, but emergency conservatorships, involving claimed psychiatric instability, can be pushed through with terrifying speed if a judge is convinced the subject is an immediate danger to themselves or their assets. Naomi had intentionally waited until the trap was perfectly set, and the steel jaws were fully locked around my finances before bringing it up at dinner. They had lured me to that house under the guise of a welcome home celebration, specifically to ambush me while I was tired, isolated, and completely unaware that I was already legally trapped. The absolute isolation of my situation crashed down on me heavily. I was sitting at a remote gas station with an empty tank, a quarter of a tank of gas left in my vehicle, and absolutely zero access to civilian capital. Every credit card in my wallet was a useless piece of plastic. My liquid cash was entirely barricaded behind a legal wall constructed by my own family. If I got pulled over by the police tonight, the system might even flag me as a ward of the state under David and Naomi's guardianship. They had effectively stripped me of my autonomy, my resources, and my legal standing as an independent adult before I even knew a war had been declared against me. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, forcing myself to breathe deeply and rationally. Panic is the enemy of strategy, and I needed to be strategic if I was going to survive this ambush. I needed a legal countermeasure, and I needed it immediately. I needed someone who knew the system, someone who knew my family dynamics, and someone who could file an emergency injunction to lift this ridiculous freeze before the morning. I pulled up my contacts and searched for Thomas Bradley. Howe was the senior partner at an elite law firm in the city and had been our family attorney for nearly 2 decades. Thomas had handled my parents' estate planning, David's numerous bankruptcy filings, and he had even reviewed the closing documents for my new historic estate. If anyone could cut through this legal nightmare and expose Naomi's filing as a fraudulent power grab, it was Thomas. I tapped his name and listened to the line ring. The sound echoed in the quiet interior of my car, each ring stretching out the tension in my chest. It was late, but Thomas always kept an emergency line open for his premium clients. The ringing stopped, and the line clicked over. I opened my mouth to speak, ready to explain the absolute insanity my brother and sister-in-law had just orchestrated. Instead of Thomas answering, a pre-recorded automated message filled my ear. "Thank you for calling the law offices of Bradley and Associates. Please be advised that our representation roster has recently been updated. If you are calling regarding the guardianship and conservatorship estate of Riley, please direct all inquiries to the designated legal representatives, David and Naomi. This firm now officially represents the conservators in all matters moving forward. Please leave a message, and we will return your call during standard business hours." I sat frozen, the phone pressed tightly against my ear as the automated voice droned on. The mechanical beep signaled the start of the recording, but I did not leave a message. I could not speak a single word. Thomas Bradley, the man I had trusted to protect my legal interests, had not just abandoned me. He had switched sides. Naomi and David had used the very wealth they were trying to steal from me to purchase the loyalty of my own lawyer. They had built a flawless legal cage, cutting off my money, my credibility, and my legal counsel in one perfectly coordinated strike. I lowered the phone and stared out into the dark night, realizing for the first time just how completely I was surrounded. I threw the car into drive and sped out of the brightly lit gas station. Panic was a luxury I could no longer afford. My military training, the very training Naomi was attempting to use against me, kicked in, completely suppressing my shock and replacing it with a cold, calculated focus. If Thomas Bradley thought he could orchestrate the theft of my entire life and then hide behind an automated voicemail greeting, he had severely underestimated the woman he was dealing with. I knew his habits. I knew his schedule. Thomas was a workaholic who prided himself on billing hours late into the night, especially when closing a lucrative deal. And stealing a $2.5 million estate certainly qualified as lucrative. I navigated the dark streets of the city, heading straight for the downtown commercial district. The towering glass facade of Bradley and Associates loomed against the night sky. The underground parking garage was secured by a heavy iron gate, but I parked my car 2 blocks away in a shadowy alleyway. I walked the remaining distance on foot, slipping into the garage through a pedestrian exit door just as a janitorial crew propped it open. The air inside the concrete bunker was damp and smelled of exhaust fumes. I found his designated parking spot easily. His pristine silver Porsche sat gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. I stepped back into the deep shadows cast by a concrete support pillar and waited. Patience is a weapon. I stood motionless in the freezing garage for over 2 hours, letting the chill seep through my jacket. I did not check my phone. I did not pace. I simply watched the elevator doors. Shortly before midnight, the heavy steel doors slid open and Thomas Bradley stepped out. He looked incredibly satisfied, adjusting his expensive wool coat and swinging his briefcase with a lightness that made my blood boil. He walked toward his Porsche, clicking the key fob to unlock the doors. I stepped out of the shadows and moved directly into his path, blocking his access to the driver's side door. Thomas jumped back, startled, dropping his keys onto the concrete floor. "Riley," he gasped, his hand flying to his chest. "What on earth are you doing lurking in a dark garage? You nearly gave me a heart attack." I did not raise my voice. I kept my posture relaxed, but completely unyielding. "It is funny, Thomas," I said smoothly. "I tried to call your office, but an automated machine told me you were busy stealing my life. I figured a personal visit was the only way to get a consultation." He quickly recovered his composure, bending down to retrieve his keys. He straightened up and let out a long, patronizing sigh, adjusting his tie. He did not look guilty. He looked profoundly annoyed. "Listen to me, Riley," he said, using his best courtroom voice. "I understand you are upset, but I strongly advise you to go back to whatever temporary housing your brother arranged and comply with the medical directives." Approaching opposing counsel in a dark parking garage is exactly the kind of erratic behavior that validates the conservatorship order. "Opposing counsel," I repeated, letting the words hang in the freezing air. "You have represented my family for 20 years. You reviewed the closing documents on my estate last month. And tonight you helped my brother and his wife freeze every asset to my name. How much did Naomi pay you to sell out your own client?" Thomas offered a cold, tight smile. He leaned against the hood of his expensive car, looking entirely too comfortable. "Representation changes, Riley. That is the nature of the legal business. Naomi and David came to me with a very compelling case and a massive retainer. They are highly motivated to ensure your estate is properly managed. I am simply facilitating the legal mechanisms to protect your assets from your own documented instability." My eyes narrowed. Documented instability. You and I both know I am perfectly sane, Thomas. A judge does not just sign an emergency freeze on a multi-million-dollar estate based on the word of a disgruntled sister-in-law. You need hard medical evidence to push an ex parte order through that fast, evidence that does not exist. Thomas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Oh, but it does exist, Riley. It exists in abundance. Your sister-in-law is far more resourceful than you give her credit for. She did not just come to me with wild accusations. She came to me with your complete classified military medical file." The air was suddenly sucked out of my lungs. I maintained my neutral expression, but my mind was spinning violently. My military medical records were locked behind Department of Defense firewalls. They were classified documents detailing my psychological evaluations following covert deployments. They were not something a civilian could simply request or stumble upon. She obtained your records. Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She brought me a comprehensive psychological profile detailing your combat trauma, your isolation tendencies, and your struggle to reintegrate into civilian life. It painted a very clear, very disturbing picture of a veteran who is entirely unfit to manage a vast financial portfolio. Naomi does not have the security clearance to access those files, I stated, my voice turning to ice. Even if she somehow requested them, it would take months of federal processing. Thomas shrugged, dismissing my logic. How she acquired them is not my concern. My concern is the validity of the documents presented to the court. And I must say, the psychological evaluations she provided were incredibly thorough. They showed severe, undeniable cognitive decline. I stepped closer to him, closing the distance until I was mere inches from his face. My military psych evaluations are flawless, Thomas. I passed every single mental fitness exam required to maintain my security clearance. Whatever Naomi showed you was fabricated. She altered federal documents. He smiled again, a sickening display of pure greed and arrogance. Does it really matter if they were slightly enhanced, Riley? The narrative fits. You are an isolated veteran who just made a massive, erratic real estate purchase. We took the file to Judge Harrison Montgomery. He is a very sympathetic judge when it comes to families trying to protect disabled veterans from themselves. I took one look at the psychological profile Naomi provided and signed the emergency order without a second thought. He was more than happy to expedite the process to keep you from causing further harm to yourself. Thomas patted his briefcase confidently. The temporary order is solid. The final hearing is scheduled for Friday. By the time you untangle the bureaucratic red tape to prove those medical records were doctored, the conservatorship will be permanent, and your brother will hold the deed to your house. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a very comfortable bed waiting for me. He brushed past me, opening his car door and sliding into the leather seat. He started the engine, the roar of the sports car filling the quiet garage. He rolled down the window, offering one last piece of advice. Do yourself a favor, Riley. Stop fighting. You have no money, no lawyer, and no credibility. Surrender the estate gracefully before you end up locked in a psychiatric ward. I watched him drive away, the red taillights disappearing up the concrete ramp. I stood alone in the empty parking garage, the cold seeping through the soles of my boots. Thomas thought he had just delivered a fatal blow. He thought he had proven how completely outmatched I was. But his arrogance had just handed me the keys to their destruction. Naomi had not just exaggerated a story to a judge. To get that emergency order, she had to actively hack into or illicitly purchase classified Department of Defense databases to acquire my initial file. Then she had to digitally doctor those federally protected documents to fabricate a fake psychological diagnosis. She submitted those forged federal records to a court of law to commit grand larceny. This was no longer a simple family dispute over a piece of real estate. This was not just a greedy brother and a jealous sister-in-law trying to manipulate civil court. Stealing and altering classified military medical records is a severe federal offense. Submitting them to a judge to steal millions of dollars elevated the crime to a massive federal conspiracy. Stolen valor, cyber espionage, and federal fraud. My family had thought they were playing a local game of civil court chess. They had no idea they had just crossed a red line that would bring the full, devastating weight of the federal government down on their heads. I pulled my phone from my pocket, dialing a secure, encrypted number I had not used since my last deployment. The shock was completely gone now, replaced by a lethal clarity. They wanted a war, and I was going to give them one. The screen of my encrypted device glowed in the darkness of the alleyway, illuminating the steering wheel of my car. I was seconds away from initiating a secure connection that would escalate this family dispute into a federal investigation. My thumb hovered over the call button, ready to bring the full weight of the Department of Defense down on Naomi and my treacherous attorney. But before I could press down, my civilian smartphone vibrated violently in the passenger seat. The bright screen shattered the shadows inside the cabin, flashing a name I had just permanently deleted from my heart: David. I stared at the caller identification for several long moments, listening to the phone vibrate against the leather upholstery. Part of me wanted to throw the device out the window and drive away, but tactical strategy dictated that I gather as much intelligence on the enemy as possible. Knowing their next move was critical. I picked up the phone, swiped the screen to answer, and brought it to my ear, remaining completely silent. "Riley, are you there?" David asked, his voice sounding strained and breathless. He let out a heavy sigh directly into the receiver, projecting the exhaustion of a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Listen, I know you are angry. I know the dinner did not go exactly as we planned, and you feel blindsided. But you need to calm down and look at this rationally. We are just trying to help you." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. His ability to weaponize his own incompetence and disguise it as compassion was truly staggering. Blindsided, I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. "You froze my bank accounts, David. You hired my own lawyer to legally hijack my life. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a coordinated ambush. You are being dramatic." "Riley," he groaned, falling right back into the gaslighting routine my parents had perfected. "We had to take swift action because you are clearly unstable. Buying a $2.5 million historic estate when you live alone is a massive red flag. You cannot manage a property like that. You are not thinking straight, and we had to step in before you ruined your own financial future." He paused, waiting for me to argue, but I let the silence stretch. When I did not take the bait, his tone shifted from patronizing to desperate. He started to play his ultimate trump card. "Naomi is pregnant, Riley," he said, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "We are going to have a baby. Do you have any idea how stressful that is for us right now? My last business venture went under, and the creditors are circling us like vultures. We are living in a cramped apartment, and the stress is making Naomi physically ill. We cannot raise your future niece or nephew in a tiny rental unit with bad plumbing. We need stability. We need a real home." The sheer audacity of his logic was paralyzing. He was openly admitting that his business had failed again and that he was drowning in debt. Yet somehow he had convinced himself that my financial success was the designated safety net for his personal failures. "So your solution to your own bankruptcy is to steal my house?" I asked flatly. "We are not stealing anything," he snapped quickly, losing his victim persona. "We are family. Families share their resources. You have all this money sitting in the bank, and you have this massive, sprawling estate that you absolutely do not need. It is entirely selfish of you to hoard all of that space when your own brother is struggling to provide for his pregnant wife. Mom and Dad agree with us. They know you are not in the right headspace to raise a family there anyway. We need that estate to raise our family properly. It is the only thing that makes sense." I was entirely delusional. He genuinely believed that because I was a single woman without a child, my hard-earned assets were simply communal property waiting to be claimed by the golden child. He saw my historic sanctuary, the home I had bled for during 6 grueling months overseas, as his rightful inheritance. "I am not giving you my house, David. Not now and not ever." David let out another frustrated sigh, this one laced with venom. "We are trying to do this the easy way, Riley, but you are forcing my hand. The conservatorship is already in place. The judge signed the emergency order. We control everything now. We own you. But Naomi and I are willing to be generous if you cooperate." "Generous," I echoed, completely deadpan. "Yes, generous," he insisted. "Here is the deal. I need you to drive to the estate right now and hand over the physical keys. You need to surrender the property to us voluntarily by midnight tonight. If you pack a small bag, hand over the keys, and agree not to fight us in court, Naomi and I will ensure you are taken care of. We will set you up in a nice, quiet apartment out in the suburbs, and we will give you a weekly allowance from your own money. We will make sure your groceries are paid for, and you have enough cash for basic necessities. But you have to surrender the keys by midnight, or we cut you off entirely. No apartment, no allowance, nothing." I sat in the dark alleyway, listening to the absolute madness pouring out of my civilian phone. My 31-year-old brother, who had never held a successful job in his adult life, was threatening to put me on a grocery allowance using my own military contracting fortune. He was demanding that I surrender my sanctuary to him simply because he had failed to provide for his own wife. I did not scream. I did not hurl insults or threaten him with the federal intelligence I possessed. I simply leaned my head back against the headrest and laughed. It was a cold, sharp, humorless sound that echoed loudly in the confined space of the car. It was the laugh of a woman who had finally realized she was entirely unburdened by the obligation of family loyalty. "Are you laughing at me?" David demanded, his voice pitching upward in anger. "I am giving you a lifeline, Riley. I am offering you a way out of this with your dignity intact. You do not have the leverage you think you have." "David," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady register. "Keep the keys. Keep the frozen accounts. Enjoy them while you can. Because by the time I am finished with you and your wife, you will both be begging to go back to that cramped rental unit." I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red icon, disconnecting the line instantly. I tossed the civilian device onto the passenger seat, cutting off his desperate demands. I took a deep breath, letting the cold night air fill my lungs. The battle lines were officially drawn. There was no going back, no peaceful resolution, and no family left to save. I reached for my encrypted device again, ready to make the call. But before my fingers could graze the screen, the civilian phone on the passenger seat lit up with a harsh chime. A new text message had arrived. I glanced over, reading the preview banner illuminated against the dark leather. It was a message from David, sent exactly 5 minutes after I had hung up on his ridiculous ultimatum. The message contained only 2 brief sentences. "You brought this on yourself. Check your social media." A heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. David was a coward, but Naomi was a calculated predator. If they had moved on to a public attack, they were trying to destroy the one thing I needed to fight them in federal court: my professional reputation. I picked up the civilian phone, unlocked the screen, and opened my primary social media application, bracing myself for whatever digital explosive Naomi had just detonated. I tapped the glowing application icon, and the screen immediately refreshed. At the very top of my feed was a video posted by Naomi. She fancied herself a lifestyle influencer, despite having less than 10,000 followers. But this particular post had already amassed over 500,000 views in a matter of hours. The caption was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, a desperate plea for help protecting our family from the devastating reality of combat trauma. I turned up the volume on my phone, letting the audio fill the quiet interior of my car. Naomi was sitting on the floor of her cramped apartment, looking entirely disheveled. Her usually pristine makeup was carefully smudged to simulate extreme exhaustion. She was holding a crumpled tissue, dabbing at her dry eyes with practiced hesitation. "I never wanted to make this public," she whimpered into the camera, her voice trembling with calculated precision. "But my husband and I are terrified. My sister-in-law Riley just returned from a military deployment and she is dangerously unwell." I watched in cold silence as my sister-in-law wove a horrific, fabricated narrative. She stared directly into the lens and described my refusal to hand over my estate as a violent, psychotic break. She claimed I had threatened her and her unborn child at the family dinner, completely omitting the fact that she had ambushed me with a fraudulent conservatorship. She weaponized every civilian stereotype about military veterans. She used buzzwords like mental health crisis, severe PTSD, and veteran instability to paint me as a ticking time bomb. She even spliced in a short audio clip of me raising my voice from earlier that evening. It was just a few seconds of me yelling at my brother, but she had cut out the context of their theft, leaving only the raw sound of my anger echoing through the speakers. "We tried to get her psychiatric help," Naomi sobbed, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "We secured a legal conservatorship to keep her safe and get her into a facility. But she is trained in psychological warfare. She is highly trained and she is completely unhinged. If you see her, please do not approach her. Please pray for our family and our safety." The comment section below the video was a digital war zone. Local news outlets had been tagged. People from my hometown were sharing the video like wildfire, treating it as a true crime emergency. My civilian phone began to vibrate continuously, with a flood of incoming notifications. I opened my text messages and watched a barrage of pure hatred scroll across the screen. My Aunt Linda, who I had not spoken to in 5 years, texted me calling me a violent disgrace to the uniform. Cousins I barely knew sent lengthy paragraphs demanding I surrender to a hospital immediately before I hurt an innocent person. But the absolute worst messages were from total strangers. People from my community who had tracked down my personal number through online data brokers were sending graphic death threats. They called me a psycho, a violent lunatic, and a danger to society. A local business owner I had known since childhood publicly commented that I was permanently banned from his store. Someone actually sent a message stating they would put me down like a rabid dog if I came near their neighborhood. Naomi had successfully weaponized the public, leveraging the very community I had sworn to protect and turning them into an angry mob hunting a phantom threat. I tossed the phone back onto the passenger seat, turning the device on silent to stop the relentless buzzing. A digital mob was actively hunting me, but I could not afford to freeze in an alleyway. I put the car in gear and drove straight toward my historic estate. If they were claiming I was violent and unstable, I needed to be inside my own fortress before the local police were weaponized against me next. The drive across town was agonizing. I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, watching every set of headlights intensely. I anticipated the flash of red and blue police sirens at every intersection, knowing that any encounter with law enforcement tonight would end with me in a psychiatric hold. I finally pulled through the massive wrought iron gates of my property, using my remote clicker to lock them securely behind me. The $2.5 million house sat in total darkness, its grand columns casting long shadows across the expansive manicured lawn. I parked in the rear courtyard out of sight from the main road and let myself in through the heavy oak back doors. The house was cold and echoing with the sound of my boots on the hardwood floors. I had not even unpacked my moving boxes yet, and now this beautiful sanctuary felt like a bunker. I walked into the sprawling front living room, leaving the overhead lights off so I could not be seen from the street. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling front windows, looking out at the dark road beyond the heavy iron gates. My mind was racing, formulating a counteroffensive. I needed to extract the metadata from Naomi's video to prove the audio was maliciously edited. I needed to contact my federal command structure to report the theft of my classified medical file. I needed to secure a new aggressive legal team outside of this corrupted city jurisdiction. I was suddenly pulled from my tactical planning by the blinding flash of high-beam headlights cutting through the darkness outside my property line. A dark sedan idled aggressively at the edge of my front gates, its engine revving loudly in the quiet neighborhood. Before I could process the make and model of the vehicle, a heavy dark object launched from the passenger side window. It sailed over the iron fence, arcing directly toward the front of my house. The impact was deafening. The massive pane of antique glass in my living room exploded inward, showering the hardwood floor and my boots with thousands of jagged, sharp shards. A heavy clay brick hit the Persian rug with a dull thud, sliding a few feet before coming to a dead stop in the center of the room. My military instincts took over instantly. I dropped my center of gravity, avoiding the secondary spray of falling glass, and moved quickly to the safety of the solid interior wall. The dark sedan peeled away, tires screeching loudly, leaving long black marks on the asphalt as it disappeared into the night. I waited in the heavy silence, listening for any further movement outside. When I was absolutely certain the immediate physical threat was gone, I crept forward, crunching over the broken glass to inspect the projectile. The brick was rough and covered in street dirt. Wrapped tightly around its center, secured with a thick piece of silver duct tape, was a crumpled piece of white notebook paper. I pulled the paper loose, ripping the tape apart, and unfolded it under the pale moonlight spilling through the shattered window. The message was scrawled in thick, angry black marker. "We know where you live, psycho. Leave town tonight or we will force you out." I stared at the crude black letters scrawled on the notebook paper. The cold wind howled through the shattered antique window, scattering more glass across my Persian rug. A normal person would have panicked. A normal person would have called the police, packed a bag, and fled the state just as the digital mob demanded. But I was not a normal person, and my family had severely miscalculated the extent of my capabilities. I crumpled the threatening note in my fist and tossed it onto the glass-covered floor. I did not bother boarding up the window. Let the neighborhood watch think I was vulnerable. Let Naomi believe her coordinated social media smear campaign was actively breaking my spirit. I turned my back on the destruction, left the dark living room, and walked straight toward the basement door. The basement of the historic estate was originally designed as a sprawling wine cellar, but I had spent my first week home completely retrofitting the space. I unlocked the heavy reinforced steel door at the bottom of the wooden stairs and stepped into my actual sanctuary. The room was fully soundproof, temperature controlled, and completely off the grid. I flicked a master switch and a massive wall of high-end monitors hummed to life, casting a cool blue glow over the bare concrete walls. Naomi and David thought they had completely paralyzed me by freezing my civilian bank accounts. They thought the money sitting in my local credit union and my standard investment portfolios represented the entirety of my wealth. They were absolute fools. I do not just work in standard corporate cybersecurity. I own and operate a private defense contracting firm that designs counterintelligence architecture for federal agencies. My civilian accounts were nothing more than a carefully constructed decoy, a small fraction of my assets used to pay property taxes and buy groceries without drawing attention. My actual wealth, the money I earned, neutralizing global threats, was heavily encrypted and stored in decentralized offshore accounts that were completely invisible to a local civilian judge. Naomi had successfully frozen a tiny puddle while I commanded a vast hidden ocean. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and rapidly typed a series of complex alphanumeric passwords. I bypassed the standard commercial internet, entirely routing my connection through a secure encrypted tunnel that bounced my signal across 3 different continents before connecting to my private financial servers. Within 90 seconds, I had full unhindered access to my primary operational funds. The balance displayed on the main screen was enough to buy my parents' entire neighborhood twice over. I had unlimited capital, but now I needed a lethal legal weapon. Thomas Bradley was a slimy corporate lawyer who manipulated civil codes, but I needed someone who understood the brutal, unforgiving nature of military justice. I opened a secure communication terminal and ran a targeted search for a highly specific name: Mitchell. I had never met the man personally, but his reputation in the private defense community was legendary. He was a former military prosecutor who had transitioned into private practice after a highly decorated career. He was utterly ruthless, universally feared in the courtroom, and specialized in federal cases involving stolen valor, espionage, and federal fraud. He was not the kind of lawyer you hired to negotiate a polite settlement. He was the exact lawyer you hired to completely annihilate your opposition and salt the earth behind them. I found his direct encrypted contact protocol and initiated a secure text relay. It was 2 in the morning, but apex predators like Mitchell rarely slept. I sent a brief, heavily encrypted message detailing the theft of my classified medical file, the forged psychiatric evaluation, and the subsequent emergency conservatorship. I attached the raw metadata from Naomi's viral video, proving she was orchestrating a coordinated digital harassment campaign. 5 minutes later, a single message popped up on my screen. I require a $100,000 retainer transferred to my offshore escrow immediately. I did not even blink. I authorized the wire transfer through my secure financial node, watching the digital currency clear international banking protocols in less than 30 seconds. My secure encrypted phone rang almost instantly. It was a restricted number. I answered and put it on speaker, setting the device on the desk. Riley, a deep, gravelly voice echoed through the quiet basement. I have received your funds and reviewed your initial packet. Your sister-in-law is incredibly arrogant. Altering Department of Defense medical records to commit real estate fraud is a fast track to federal prison. We are going to bypass the local civil judge completely and file an emergency federal injunction by dawn. Do whatever it takes, Mitchell, I replied, my eyes fixed on the glowing monitors. I want the conservatorship shattered, and I want every single person involved held accountable. Consider it done, he said, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. But I need you to do what you do best. If they are bold enough to forge federal documents, They are hiding other crimes. Get into their digital lives. Find their leverage. I will handle the legal strike, you handle the intelligence gathering. He disconnected the line. I leaned forward, cracking my knuckles. The defense phase of this war was officially over. It was time to go on the offensive. Naomi and David believed they were criminal masterminds, but their operational security was practically non-existent. They treated the internet like a playground, leaving massive digital footprints everywhere they went. I launched a proprietary algorithm I had designed for tracking hostile state actors and pointed it directly at my own family. I started with David. My brother was a creature of habit. He used the exact same variations of passwords for his email, his social media, and his cloud storage since we were teenagers. I ran a brute force script against his primary accounts, masking my IP address to make it look like the login attempts were originating from his own local zip code. It took my software exactly 4 minutes to crack his main iCloud account. The weakness of his security was almost insulting. I bypassed the two-factor authentication by intercepting the digital token, routing it through a mirrored server before it ever reached his cellular device. Suddenly, I was staring at the entire contents of his digital life spread across my secondary monitor. I sifted through years of mundane photographs, failed business proposals, and frantic emails begging my parents for money. I saw the hidden digital receipts for Naomi's designer handbags proving she was maxing out secret credit cards while claiming poverty. I downloaded everything, creating a mirrored backup of his entire digital existence on my secure server. But as I dug deeper into the file directory, something caught my eye. The screen flashed bright green and a satisfying chime echoed through the soundproof room. Access granted. The folder unzipped, spilling its contents across my massive display. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the file names. There were dozens of portable document format files, mostly legal drafts and property appraisals. I clicked on the most recently modified document titled Estate Transfer Protocol. The document loaded, and the sheer scale of Naomi's deception hit me like a physical blow to the chest. David had stood on the phone just hours earlier, crying about how his pregnant wife desperately needed my sprawling historic home to raise their child. My parents had justified freezing my life because they genuinely believed my brother needed a safe suburban fortress for his growing family. It was all a meticulously crafted lie. Naomi had absolutely no intention of ever stepping foot inside my house. She did not want to live in the estate. She wanted to liquidate it. The document on my screen was a fully drafted off-market real estate contract. It was drawn up and ready to be executed the exact second the judge made the emergency conservatorship permanent on Friday. Naomi had arranged a quiet, private sale of my $2.5 million property. But she was not selling it for market value. The contract listed the agreed purchase price at a mere $500,000, a fraction of its actual worth. I read through the heavily sanitized legal jargon, my anger burning cold and sharp. By selling the property off-market for a massive loss, Naomi and David could bypass the lengthy public listing process. They could bypass standard inspections and mortgage approvals. They were staging a fire sale to convert my physical sanctuary into liquid, untraceable cash overnight. They would take the $500,000, pay off their suffocating credit card debts, and disappear long before my parents or the courts ever realized the historic home was gone. The narrative about needing a family home was nothing more than a convenient emotional weapon to manipulate my parents into compliance. I scrolled down to the bottom of the drafted agreement looking for the purchasing party. The buyer was not listed as an individual person. The space for the buyer's signature was stamped with the name of a limited liability shell company called Obsidian Capital Group. Right below that, in the section designating the escrow agent holding the cash, I saw a signature that made my blood boil all over again. Thomas Bradley. My corrupt former attorney was listed as the sole facilitator of the transaction, taking a massive 20% commission fee for pushing the sale through civil court. But something about the contract still did not make sense. You do not just find a buyer willing to hand over $500,000 in pure cash within 24 hours without a catch. I pulled up a new encrypted terminal window and began running a deep background diagnostic on Obsidian Capital Group. Shell companies are designed to be invisible, layered behind registered agents and fake corporate addresses to protect the true owners. But in the digital age, absolute anonymity is a myth. Every financial transaction leaves a shadow. Every email sends a digital echo. I just had to know where to listen. I bypassed standard corporate registries and tapped directly into a global network of domain hosting records. I found the initial website registration for Obsidian Capital Group. It was a blank placeholder site hosted on a server physically located in the Cayman Islands. I initiated a reverse IP trace, bouncing my connection through international relays to strip away the proxy protections. I needed to see who was paying the monthly server maintenance fees. Lines of code cascaded down my monitor as my algorithm chewed through the digital camouflage. The trace jumped from the Cayman Islands to a server farm in Cyprus, then bounced to a proxy in Eastern Europe, before finally resolving on a cluster of active IP addresses. I captured the network data and cross-referenced it with my private defense intelligence databases. The results populated on my screen, and the blood completely drained from my face. This was not a group of aggressive real estate flippers. The IP addresses paying for Obsidian Capital Group belonged to a massive organized dark money syndicate. I was looking at a financial network explicitly flagged by the federal government for laundering illicit funds through undervalued real estate transactions. They targeted desperate people deeply in debt, offering fast cash in exchange for properties they could use to clean their dirty money. Naomi had not just hired a corrupt lawyer to steal my house. She had somehow gotten herself entangled with a highly sophisticated criminal organization. She had promised them a $2.5 million historic estate for pennies on the dollar, and in return, they were going to provide her with the liquid cash she needed to escape her financial ruin. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying clarity: the military-grade encryption on the folder, the impossibly fast legal filings, the brutal social media smear campaign designed to discredit me immediately. Naomi did not orchestrate this alone. She did not have the intellect or the resources to pull off a heist of this magnitude. The dark money syndicate was backing her. They had provided the legal strategy, the digital security, and the capital to buy off Thomas Bradley. They were pulling the strings from the shadows, using my greedy sister-in-law as their willing puppet. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the flashing red alerts on my monitor. My family thought they were participating in a domestic dispute over a piece of property. They had absolutely no idea that Naomi had just invited an international criminal syndicate into our lives. She had sold them my house before she even legally owned it. If she failed to deliver the property by Friday, the syndicate would not just walk away. They would come to collect their investment. The digital mob throwing bricks through my window was suddenly the least of my concerns. I was no longer fighting a petty civil war against my relatives. I was actively standing between a lethal dark money operation and their multi-million-dollar payday. I pivoted my attention back to the mirrored backup of David's digital life. I isolated his financial records, completely ignoring the legitimate bank statements he used for his taxes. Instead, I focused my search on encrypted messaging applications and hidden digital wallets. I ran a cross-reference pattern matching the IP addresses from Obsidian Capital Group with every single contact in my brother's phone. The algorithm chewed through the data for 3 agonizing minutes before a massive red flag triggered on my secondary monitor. It was a shadow ledger hidden inside a seemingly benign mobile game application on David's phone. I extracted the data and converted it into a readable spreadsheet. The numbers were staggering. For the past 3 years, David and Naomi's lavish lifestyle had not just been funded by my parents draining their retirement accounts. That money had run out long ago. To maintain their illusion of wealth, to keep buying designer handbags and leasing luxury vehicles, they had turned to underground lenders. My brother, the golden child, with his endless string of failed entrepreneurial ventures, had taken out a series of massive high-interest loans from a violent loan shark syndicate. His last business, the luxury pet grooming app, was nothing more than a desperate front to wash a small portion of the dirty money. But the business failed, the interest rates compounded exponentially, and the syndicate was no longer accepting excuses. According to the Shadow Ledger, David and Naomi currently owed the organization exactly $1.5 million in pure cash. I opened the attached communication logs, reading the encrypted messages exchanged between David and a burner number associated with the syndicate. The threats were not subtle. They were graphic, violent, and highly specific. They detailed exactly what would happen to David and his pregnant wife if the debt was not settled by the end of the month. The syndicate did not care about his failed businesses or his sob stories. They wanted their money, and they were perfectly willing to extract it in blood if necessary. The pieces fell perfectly into place. This was the reason for the terrifying speed of the conservatorship. This was why Naomi was willing to forge classified federal documents and risk federal prison. They were cornered rats. They needed $1.5 million to save their own lives, and they looked at my newly purchased $2.5 million estate as their only escape route. They were going to sell my home to the syndicate for a fraction of its value to wipe their debt clean, leaving me permanently locked in a psychiatric facility with absolutely nothing. A sudden sickening thought crept into my mind, chilling me faster than the cold concrete of the basement walls. My parents. Richard and Patricia had sat on that living room sofa and aggressively defended Naomi. They had looked me dead in the eye and told me I was mentally unstable. They had claimed this was all for my own protection. But how much did they actually know? Did they just blindly believe Naomi's fabricated medical records, or were they actively participating in the cover-up? I did not want to know the answer, but tactical survival requires absolute truth. I opened a new terminal and targeted my parents' shared email account, non-existent. I bypassed their basic login credentials in less than 10 seconds and gained full access to their inbox. I ran a search query using the keywords estate debt and David. A lengthy email thread popped up instantly, dated 2 weeks before I even returned from my deployment. The subject line simply read options. I clicked on the thread and began to read. The physical betrayal hit me so hard I actually had to grip the edge of my desk to steady myself. It was a panicked conversation between Richard, Patricia, and David. David had confessed everything to them. He told them about the $1.5 million debt. He told them about the violent threats from the loan sharks. He admitted that the syndicate was going to hurt him and Naomi if they did not pay. And then I read my mother's response. Patricia, the woman who had painted my childhood bedroom and baked me birthday cakes, had typed out a plan of action with cold, calculated precision. "We cannot let them hurt David," she wrote. "We have tried to get a second mortgage on our house, but the bank denied us. The only asset left in this family is Riley's new estate. Riley is strong. She has military training and she is tough. She can handle a temporary psychiatric hold. We will get the conservatorship, sell the property to clear David's debt, and then we can let Riley out of the facility in a few months. She will be angry, but she will survive. If we do not do this, David will be killed. We have to save our boy." My father had replied simply, "Agreed. We move forward with Naomi's plan. May God forgive us." They knew. They knew everything. They knew I was perfectly sane. They knew Naomi was going to forge documents and steal my entire net worth. They knew they were handing me over to a corrupt legal system that would strip away my human rights. And they actively agreed to do it. They knowingly and willingly chose to sacrifice my freedom, my reputation, and my home just to keep their golden boy out of the hands of violent criminals. I was nothing to them but collateral damage, a disposable asset to be liquidated for David's survival. The glowing monitors blurred slightly as a single tear escaped my eye, tracing a hot path down my cold cheek. I wiped it away violently. That was the last tear I would ever shed for the people who used to be my family. The betrayal was absolute, the severing of ties permanent. A sharp ping from my interception software pulled my focus back to the main screen. I had set a real-time alert for any new communications to David's phone. A fresh message had just arrived from the syndicate's burner number. I opened the intercept and read the final ultimatum. The message was chillingly brief. "You have 48 hours, David. The judge approves the permanent order tomorrow morning. The deed transfers by tomorrow night. If the property is not ours by midnight on Friday, we are not sending lawyers. We are sending the cleaners." I checked the digital clock in the corner of my monitor. It was 3 in the morning on Thursday, the final emergency court hearing. The one where Judge Harrison Montgomery was scheduled to make my conservatorship permanent was set for 9 o'clock the next morning. David and Naomi were completely out of time, running on borrowed hours and false confidence. They thought they had perfectly orchestrated my destruction to save themselves. They had no idea that I had just hired a ruthless federal prosecutor. They had no idea I had downloaded their entire criminal conspiracy to a secure offshore server. And they had absolutely no idea that when the sun came up, I was going to walk into that courtroom and burn their entire world to the ground. The morning sun breached the horizon, casting long, cold shadows across the concrete steps of the county courthouse. I stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, wearing a sharply tailored navy suit, my posture perfectly straight. I did not look like a woman on the verge of a psychiatric break. I looked like a soldier preparing for a siege. Beside me stood Attorney Mitchell. In person, he was even more intimidating than his voice suggested. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with steel-gray hair and eyes that registered zero emotion. He carried a single black leather briefcase containing the digital hellfire we had compiled in my basement just hours before. "Are you ready, Riley?" he asked, his voice a low rumble over the city traffic. "Let us end this," I replied. We walked through the heavy brass doors, bypassing the bustling civilian crowds and heading straight for Department 47. When we pushed through the double wooden doors, the heavy silence of the courtroom was suffocating. David and Naomi were already seated at the petitioner's table. Thomas Bradley sat between them, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Naomi was dressed in a conservative beige dress, a stark contrast to her usual flashy designer labels. She had styled her hair to look slightly unkempt, playing the role of the exhausted, terrified relative perfectly. When she saw me walk in, her eyes widened in mock fear. She actually shrank back against David, who wrapped a protective arm around her. Thomas Bradley smirked, leaning back in his chair. He assumed I was walking in alone, unrepresented, and completely defeated. But when Mitchell stepped into the aisle right behind me, Thomas Bradley's smug expression instantly evaporated. As a former military prosecutor, Mitchell had a reputation that preceded him in every legal circle. Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the heavy black briefcase Mitchell placed on the defense table. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Harrison Montgomery swept into the room, his black robe billowing behind him. He was an older man with a severe face and a reputation for fast-tracking conservatorships. He took his seat at the bench, adjusting his glasses and immediately glaring in my direction. "Let us get this over with," Judge Montgomery snapped, banging his gavel once. "I have reviewed the emergency filings. We are here to determine if the temporary asset freeze and conservatorship over the respondent should remain in place pending a final transfer of authority. Call your first witness, Mr. Bradley." Thomas stood clearing his throat nervously. "We call Naomi to the stand, Your Honor." Naomi walked to the witness box, her shoulders trembling. She took the oath and sat down, gripping the edges of the wooden enclosure. For the next 20 minutes, she delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. She wept openly, dabbing her eyes with a tissue as she described my supposed violent outbursts. She painted a picture of a broken, unhinged veteran who was a danger to everyone around her. "She completely lost her mind at our family dinner," Naomi sobbed, her voice cracking perfectly. "She was screaming about conspiracies and military operations. She locked herself in that massive house and refuses to let anyone in. We even tried to visit her last night to bring her food, and she threw a brick through her own front window in a paranoid rage. We are terrified, Your Honor. My husband and I are expecting a child, and Riley is violently unpredictable. We just want her to get the psychiatric help she desperately needs before she kills someone." It was a masterful web of lies, spinning the attack on my house into evidence of my own insanity. Judge Montgomery listened with a sympathetic expression, nodding slowly as Naomi cried. "Thank you for your bravery in coming forward, young lady," the judge said, his voice dripping with misplaced compassion. "You may step down. Does the defense have any cross-examination?" Mitchell stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "No questions for this witness, Your Honor, but the defense would like to present immediate physical evidence that invalidates this entire proceeding." Judge Montgomery frowned, leaning forward. "Proceed, counsel." Mitchell opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents secured with a red seal. "Your Honor, opposing counsel submitted a psychological evaluation claiming my client suffers from severe cognitive decline. That document is a complete fabrication." I have here the official classified medical records from the Department of Defense, authorized directly by my client's commanding officer at 0600 hours this morning. These records prove my client has passed every psychological fitness exam with perfect marks. Furthermore, I have digital forensic evidence proving that the petitioner actively altered federal documents to secure this emergency freeze. The courtroom went dead silent. David turned pale white, his hands shaking on the table. Thomas Bradley looked like he was going to be sick. Mitchell stepped forward, offering the authenticated federal documents to the bailiff to hand to the judge. "This is not a family dispute, Your Honor," Mitchell continued, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "This is a coordinated act of federal fraud and stolen valor. My client is a highly decorated cybersecurity expert, and the petitioners are attempting to use this court to steal her assets." I watched Judge Montgomery, expecting him to read the documents, expecting the swift hammer of justice to fall on my brother and his wife. Instead, the judge's face turned bright red with fury. He did not even open the folder. He grabbed the stack of Department of Defense records and slammed them back onto his desk. "I will not tolerate this kind of theatrical ambush in my courtroom." Judge Montgomery bellowed, his voice rattling the microphone. "These documents were not submitted through the proper discovery channels. You cannot just march in here and present unverified medical records at a temporary injunction hearing. They bear the official seal of the United States military, Your Honor." Mitchell fired back, not backing down an inch. "They are self-authenticating." "They are inadmissible, Judge," Montgomery roared, slamming his gavel down repeatedly. "I am striking this so-called evidence from the record immediately. The petitioners have provided a sworn affidavit and a medical profile that I have already reviewed and accepted. I will not have you turning my courtroom into a federal circus, Mr. Mitchell." I stared at the judge, my mind racing. This was not just judicial bias. This was active, aggressive suppression. He was ignoring federal proof of a crime to protect a fraudulent civil order. He was railroading me, and he did not care who knew it. The realization hit me like a freight train. Montgomery was not just a lazy judge. He was the vital legal component of the dark money syndicate. Given the respondent's hostile demeanor today and the disturbing testimony regarding her violent behavior last night, I am ruling in favor of the petitioners. Judge Montgomery declared, his eyes locked on me with pure disdain. "The emergency asset freeze remains in full effect. The temporary conservatorship stands. This court will reconvene tomorrow morning, Friday at 9 o'clock sharp, for the final hearing, to officially and permanently transfer all property and financial rights to David and Naomi." He banged his gavel one last time, finalizing his decree. "We are adjourned." The judge stood and stormed out of the courtroom, leaving a suffocating silence in his wake. Naomi let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, hugging David tightly. Thomas Bradley wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, giving Mitchell a smug, victorious glare. They had won the battle. Judge Montgomery had just handed them the keys to my entire life and given them the exact timeline they needed. They had until Friday to finalize the property transfer to the dark money syndicate, and the judge had just guaranteed they would have total legal authority to do it. The 48-hour deadline set by the loan sharks was perfectly aligned. If I did not break this corrupt legal cage by tomorrow morning, I would lose everything, and my brother would walk away a millionaire. I walked out of the county courthouse with Mitchell right by my side, our footsteps echoing sharply against the polished marble floor. Behind us, I could hear the muffled sound of Naomi and David celebrating their temporary victory. Thomas Bradley was laughing loudly, clapping my brother on the back, as if they had just won a legitimate legal battle. They had no idea what was actually happening beneath the surface. They thought Judge Harrison Montgomery had shielded them permanently. They thought their conspiracy was completely airtight. But as I slid into the passenger seat of my car, I felt a cold surge of absolute clarity. Judge Montgomery was not just a biased official playing favorites. He was the linchpin of the entire criminal racket. Mitchell slammed his briefcase shut on the back seat and looked over at me, his face grim. "That judge is completely compromised, Riley." He refused to look at the Department of Defense records because he did not want official proof on the public docket. He is protecting that fraudulent conservatorship because he has a personal stake in the outcome. "I already know why, Mitchell," I replied. my fingers flying across my laptop keyboard as I booted up a secure satellite connection. Montgomery is not just a sympathetic ear for a grieving family. He is the hidden financial partner behind Obsidian Capital Group. Mitchell raised an eyebrow, leaning closer. You can prove that. Before we left the courtroom, I managed to pull his public financial disclosures and cross-reference them with the dark money IP traces I ran last night in the basement. I just need to route through our corporate satellite node to bypass local network latency. Give me 2 minutes. We drove away from the courthouse, heading straight back to my historic estate. The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet suburban streets, but inside the car the atmosphere was ice cold. We pulled through the wrought iron gates and rushed down to the subterranean basement. The massive wall of monitors hummed to life, casting that familiar cool blue glow across the concrete walls. I sat down in my leather ergonomic chair and hooked my encrypted terminal directly into our private satellite uplink. When you track dark money, you do not look at local bank statements. You look at shell company capitalization records and offshore liquidity pools. Earlier this morning, I traced the funding of Obsidian Capital Group to a network of masked accounts in Cyprus. But the final authorization code, the digital signature required to clear real estate liquidations under expedited emergency orders, always links back to a primary notary trust. I hammered a series of complex commands, executing a brute force decryption script across multiple encrypted server nodes. The progress bar moved rapidly across the screen. 50%, 80%, complete. The main monitor flashed amber, and a comprehensive financial web mapped itself out across the display. I zoomed in on the primary notary trust funding the shell company and the exact name I expected to see populated on the screen in bright red letters: Judge Harrison Montgomery. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying precision. Judge Montgomery and Thomas Bradley had been running a long-term judicial racket across the county. They targeted wealthy, vulnerable individuals, specifically elderly homeowners or isolated veterans with high-value properties. They would utilize corrupt insiders like Thomas to manufacture false competency claims, file emergency petitions, and push them through Department 40 once under Montgomery's direct jurisdiction. Once the emergency conservatorships were locked in, the judge would authorize off-market forced liquidations, selling the real estate to Obsidian Capital Group for pennies on the dollar. The syndicate would wash their dark money, and Montgomery and Bradley would split massive multi-million-dollar kickbacks hidden behind complex layers of offshore trusts. Naomi and David were not the masterminds of this operation. They were just low-level pawns who had stumbled into the syndicate's crosshairs because of their massive debt. The syndicate had used Naomi to execute the initial family ambush, providing her with the forged medical files and the legal framework. In exchange, Naomi and David thought they were saving themselves from the loan sharks while keeping a tidy profit, completely unaware that they were handing a $2.5 million estate to a corrupt judge and his criminal partners for a tiny fraction of its true value. "Look at this, Mitchell," I said, pointing to the data layout on the screen. "It is an industrial-scale real estate laundering ring operated right out of the county courthouse. Judge Montgomery has weaponized his entire bench to steal property from citizens under the guise of medical protection." Mitchell stared at the monitors, his expression darkening into a lethal scowl. "This is bigger than civil fraud or stolen valor. This is systemic federal racketeering. We have enough evidence here to take down Montgomery Bradley and your entire family in one fell swoop. I am compiling this package for the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now." I prepped the encrypted data transfer packet bundling the financial records, the shell company wire logs, and the authenticated military documents into a single uncrackable file. I routed the destination address directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the FBI field office, 2 states over, ensuring that local law enforcement corruption could not intercept or flag the transmission. The progress bar for the FBI upload climbed steadily: 10%, 30%, 50%. We were seconds away from detonating a legal bomb that would utterly annihilate Judge Montgomery's career and send my entire family straight to federal prison. Suddenly, the humming sound of the basement cooling fans died away instantly. The glowing blue monitors flickered violently once, twice, and then plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The auxiliary emergency lights failed to kick in. The heavy security doors locked automatically with a loud metallic click. The entire estate had been completely cut off from the power grid in a single coordinated microsecond. I sat frozen in the dark leather chair, my laptop screen casting a dim, ghostly light across my face as the wireless connection icon flashed frantically and then flatlined. The upload to the FBI had frozen at 89%. The syndicate had not waited for Friday. They knew we were closing in, and they had just cut the power to trap us in the dark. Mitchell reached inside his jacket, drawing a compact concealed carry weapon with practiced military efficiency. The heavy boots continued to thud across the antique hardwood floors directly above our heads. There was not just one set of footsteps. I counted at least 4 distinct heavy treads moving methodically through my living room. They were not sweeping the house with tactical precision. They were stomping, destroying, tearing through my sanctuary with loud, chaotic violence. A massive crash shook the ceiling plaster loose. They had just thrown something incredibly heavy right through my custom-stained glass window. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the ventilation shafts, followed by the sickening crunch of wood splintering. They were taking bats or sledgehammers to the expensive antique furniture I had painstakingly restored. I did not panic. I reached blindly under the console desk and flipped a heavy toggle switch. A secondary localized battery grid kicked in instantly. The main monitors remained dead, but my specialized tactical surveillance tablet booted up, casting a dim green glow across my face. I had wired this house with military-grade security cameras disguised as motion sensors and smoke detectors, completely independent of the municipal power grid. I tapped the screen, pulling up the night vision feed from the main floor. 4 men dressed in dark clothing and ski masks were systematically destroying my living room. One was swinging a steel pipe into the massive television screen, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Another was actively slicing the Italian leather sofas to ribbons with a hunting knife, pulling the stuffing out and throwing it across the room. A third man was overturning heavy oak bookshelves, sending hundreds of volumes crashing to the floor. Mitchell leaned over my shoulder, his gun still drawn, his eyes narrowing at the digital feed. "They are not looking for us, Riley," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the destruction above. "This is not an assassination team, and it is definitely not the professional cleaners from the Dark Money Syndicate. If they wanted us dead, they would be breaching the basement doors right now. They are completely ignoring the lower levels." Howe was absolutely right. Professional hitmen do not waste time slashing upholstery and breaking pottery. I switched the camera view to the exterior driveway feed. A fifth man was standing next to my pristine vintage muscle car, driving a heavy blade into the sidewalls of all 4 tires. He keyed a massive jagged line across the custom paint job before smashing the headlights with a crowbar. My mind raced, analyzing the tactical variables. Why would Naomi and David hire cheap thugs to vandalize my property instead of sending the syndicate professionals? Then the realization hit me with brilliant, sickening clarity. This was the final stage of their fabricated narrative. They were creating a war zone. Judge Montgomery had granted the temporary conservatorship based on Naomi's tears and the lie that I was dangerously unstable. She had testified under oath just hours ago that I was having violent outbursts, throwing bricks through my own windows, and suffering from severe psychological breaks. But they knew they needed irrefutable physical proof to make the order permanent on Friday morning. They needed the police to arrive at a completely destroyed estate. The police would walk into a house that looked like a bomb had gone off. They would see the slashed furniture, the broken glass, the destroyed vehicle, and the massive holes punched into the drywall. Naomi would then call the authorities, playing the terrified sister-in-law, claiming I had completely snapped and gone on a destructive rampage, destroying my own property in a paranoid rage. It was the perfect visual evidence to lock me in a psychiatric ward permanently and ensure the judge signed over the deed without a single question. Mitchell pulled his cellular phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the keypad. The localized cell tower scramblers had not been activated, which meant we still had a signal. "I am calling the local authorities," he stated flatly. "We can have police cruisers here in 3 minutes. We catch these thugs in the act and trace their payment directly back to your brother." I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his phone, pushing it down. Do not call them, I said, my voice steady and cold. Mitchell stared at me in disbelief. Riley, they are destroying hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of your property. If we do not call the police right now, they are going to finish the job and vanish into the night. Let them, I replied, keeping my eyes locked on the surveillance feed. If you let them leave, they will execute their plan. Mitchell argued, his voice tight with frustration. They will call the police themselves. They will tell the responding officers you did this. You are playing right into their hands. I zoomed in on the camera feed, watching the man with the steel pipe smash my grandmother's antique dining table into splinters. The destruction was catastrophic, but it was also incredibly contained. They were completely unaware of the hidden cameras recording their every move in high definition. They had no idea my customized security system was currently capturing clear, uncompressed audio of them shouting instructions to each other. I tapped the audio enhancement protocol, isolating a conversation near the destroyed kitchen island. Make sure you smash the plates, one of the masked men yelled, his voice crystal clear through my earpiece. The husband said he wants the kitchen looking like a grenade went off. He is paying us a $5,000 bonus if the cops think she completely lost her mind. I tapped the save command, securing the audio file into an encrypted offshore backup. They had just given me a recorded verbal confirmation of David orchestrating the hit. They did not know the facial recognition software was already logging the partial profiles visible through their cheap masks. I want them to call the police, I whispered. I want Naomi to stand in front of my shattered windows tomorrow morning and lie to the detectives. I want her to build this trap as deep and as inescapable as possible. Because when we step into that courtroom on Friday, I am not just going to prove I am sane. I am going to play the high-definition video of her hired mercenaries destroying my home directly to the federal agents. Mitchell slowly lowered his phone, a grim understanding washing over his hardened features. He looked at the surveillance screen and then back at me. You are going to let them think they have completely destroyed you. Yes, I said. I sat back in my leather chair, surrounded by the darkness of the basement. Above me, the sounds of glass shattering and heavy thuds continued to echo through the floorboards. They were tearing my physical world apart, believing they were writing my final chapter. They thought they had backed me into a corner. I watched the monitors tracking their movements, mapping their exact exit routes. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic. A slow, dangerous smile crept across my face. Let them break the furniture. Let them slash the tires. They were just building the very gallows I was going to use to hang them all. The thugs cleared out of the estate by 3 in the morning. Mitchell and I stayed in the basement monitoring the live surveillance feeds until the first gray light of dawn finally crept through the high ventilation windows. The house above us was completely silent. It was the terrifying hollow stillness that always follows a massive bombing raid. I saved the final high-definition video files to my secure offshore server, locked the system down, and walked up the stairs with Mitchell right behind me. The main floor was a masterpiece of manufactured devastation. The thugs had done exactly what they were paid to do. My antique dining table was reduced to jagged kindling. The custom stained glass windows were scattered across the hardwood floors like a blanket of shattered diamonds. The Italian leather sofas were gutted, their synthetic stuffing violently thrown across the walls. The kitchen island was covered in smashed porcelain plates and deeply gouged wood. It was exactly the kind of chaotic war zone Naomi needed for her police report. But the police did not arrive first. As the morning sun fully breached the horizon, casting long beams of light through the broken windows, the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the silence. I stood in the center of my destroyed living room and watched through the shattered front bay window as my parents' silver sedan parked directly behind my decimated vintage muscle car. Richard and Patricia stepped out of the vehicle. They did not immediately dial 911. They did not rush toward the house in a frantic panic to see if their daughter was bleeding or dead. They simply stood in the driveway, surveying the external damage with calculated expressions before putting on their theatrical masks of parental horror. They rushed up the front steps, stepping over the shattered glass and pushing open the broken front door. My mother gasped, throwing her hands over her mouth as she took in the ruined living room. "Oh my God, Riley," she cried out, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed devastation. "What have you done to yourself? What have you done to your beautiful home? My father stood beside her, shaking his head with a heavy, sorrowful sigh. We warned you, Riley, he said, his tone dripping with patronizing pity. We told you the post-traumatic stress disorder was getting worse. You are having a complete psychological breakdown. Look at this massive destruction. You destroyed your own sanctuary. You need help. Mitchell stood silently in the deep shadows of the hallway, his hand resting comfortably near his concealed weapon, but I raised a single finger signaling him to hold his position. I wanted my parents to dig their graves as deep as possible. I stood amidst the wreckage of my life, staring at the two people who had raised me. I did not yell. I did not cry. I am fine, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I did not do this. My mother stepped forward, reaching out a trembling hand. Sweetheart, please stop lying to us. Stop lying to yourself. Naomi called us last night, terrified that you were going to hurt someone. We drove over here at first light, hoping we could reach you before the police get involved. You need severe medical intervention, Riley. We love you so much and we cannot watch you destroy your life like this. Check yourself into the psychiatric facility voluntarily today. Let David and Naomi manage the estate while you heal. Do it to save your own dignity. Save my dignity. I repeated, tasting the bitter bile rising in the back of my throat. I looked directly at my father, the man who had taught me how to ride a bicycle, the man who had proudly pinned my military medals to my dress uniform just 5 years ago. Is that what this is about, Dad? Saving my dignity? Richard sighed deeply, crossing his arms over his chest. It is the only logical way, Riley. If you fight this in court tomorrow morning, they will drag your military record through the mud. They will declare you legally incompetent in front of a public gallery. If you just sign the voluntary admission papers and transfer temporary power of attorney to your brother, this can all be handled quietly. Do not be stubborn. Do not make this harder than it has to be. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, crunching broken glass beneath my heavy tactical boots. The silence in the room became incredibly suffocating. I locked eyes with my father and let the facade completely shatter. I know about the... I said, my voice dropping an octave, sending a shockwave through the room. I know about the hidden shadow ledger on David's phone. I know he owes $1.5 million to a violent underground syndicate. My mother froze instantly. Her trembling hands dropped rigidly to her sides. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and utterly terrified. My father stiffened, his jaw clenching tight. I kept walking forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing mere inches away from him. I know about Obsidian Capital Group. I continued, my words striking them like physical blows. I know Naomi drafted an off-market contract to sell my home to those loan sharks for $500,000. And I know you both explicitly agreed to sacrifice my freedom and my property to keep your golden boy out of a body bag. I read your emails, all of them. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The charade was dead. The grieving parent act vanished into the cold morning air. I waited for the apologies. I waited for the overwhelming shame. I waited for my parents to collapse and beg for my forgiveness. Instead, my father's expression hardened into a mask of pure cold steel. He did not look ashamed. He looked completely defiant. Your brother made some terrible business decisions, Richard said, his voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth. He got involved with the wrong people, and they are going to kill him, Riley. They are going to kill his pregnant wife. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the absolute lack of remorse. So you decided to throw me to the wolves. You decided to let a corrupt judge strip away my basic human rights and lock me in a cage. You knowingly participated in a massive fraud to steal my house. Family requires sacrifice. Riley, my father snapped, his voice echoing off the broken walls. You are a single woman with a $2.5 million house you do not even need. You have your military pension. You are physically strong. You can survive a few months in a psychiatric facility. David cannot survive this. If we do not give them this house, they will violently murder him. You are being entirely selfish by standing in the way. The sheer audacity of his twisted logic hit me with staggering force. He genuinely believed he was completely in the right. He believed that my life, my sanity, and my hard-earned sanctuary were perfectly acceptable casualties to fix David's colossal failures. My mother refused to make eye contact, staring down at the broken plates on the floor. "Get out!" I whispered, the anger burning hot and bright in my chest. "Riley, please, you have to understand," my mother started, her voice barely a whisper. "I said get off my property!" I roared, my voice shaking the remaining glass in the heavy window frames. "You are no longer my parents. You are active accomplices to federal racketeering and attempted kidnapping. You thought I was just collateral damage. You thought I would just roll over and surrender because you used the civil court system as a weapon." I walked over to the ruined front door and kicked it wide open. My father grabbed my mother's arm, pulling her aggressively toward the exit. He stopped on the threshold, glaring back at me with pure, unadulterated venom. "You are going to lose everything tomorrow morning." He sneered, his face red with rage. "Judge Montgomery is signing that permanent order and you cannot stop it. The police will be here in 20 minutes to document your violent episode. You are completely finished." I smiled, a cold, lethal smile that made my father physically recoil. "You have absolutely no idea who you just declared war on," I said, my tone dropping to a terrifying calm. "You chose the wrong side of a war you do not even begin to understand. Tell David and Naomi I will see them in court tomorrow. And tell them to bring a very good federal defense attorney." "They took the bait," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "They swallowed it whole," I replied. "Now we set the hook." We moved back down to the subterranean basement. The air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone from the massive server racks. I settled into my leather ergonomic chair and woke the primary monitors from their localized battery backup. We had massive amounts of work to do, and the clock was aggressively ticking down to the final Friday morning hearing. I pulled up the primary surveillance logs from the localized solid-state drive. The hired thugs thought they were operating in pitch-black darkness, assuming the severed power lines gave them total invisibility. They were entirely wrong. My estate was equipped with military-grade infrared sensors and low-light optical lenses that did not rely on the municipal grid. I isolated the high-definition video files and routed them to the main display. The massive screen filled with the crisp, monochromatic footage of the four men tearing my living room apart. The infrared cameras captured their heat signatures in glowing white against the dark background. I could see the sweat on their foreheads through their cheap fabric ski masks. I ran a localized facial recognition algorithm against a downloaded copy of the Federal Criminal Database. These men were not sophisticated criminal masterminds. They were low-level enforcers with extensive, easily searchable records. The system quickly matched their partial profiles based on bone structure and retinal spacing. Within seconds, I had their full legal names, their known gang affiliations, and their lengthy previous convictions for aggravated assault and destruction of property. But physical identification was only half the battle. I needed undeniable malicious intent. I opened the enhanced audio files I had captured during their rampage. Mitchell leaned in close, crossing his arms over his broad chest as I deployed a sound engineering application. I systematically isolated the vocal frequencies, filtering out the deafening noise of breaking glass and splintering wood. The conversation near my destroyed kitchen island played back with terrifying, pristine clarity. "I want this place looking like a literal war zone." The lead thug grunted, his voice echoing through my high-fidelity speakers. "The brother David is paying us a $5,000 cash bonus if the responding cops think she completely lost her mind. His wife Naomi specifically said to smash all the expensive stuff first. They need the judge to see this house in pieces by tomorrow morning, or the deal falls through." Mitchell let out a slow, low whistle. "That is premeditated destruction of property, conspiracy to commit federal fraud, and direct criminal implication of your brother and sister-in-law. It is a sealed verbal confession recorded legally on your own private security system." "It is just the foundation," I replied, my fingers flying rapidly across the mechanical keyboard. "Now we build the rest of the cage." I began compiling the ultimate master dossier. This was no longer just a defensive legal strategy for a petty civil court dispute. This was a comprehensive federal racketeering indictment package. I started by locking the encrypted video and audio files into the main folder, linking the hired thugs directly to David and Naomi. Then I pulled the forged Department of Defense medical records Naomi had submitted to secure the emergency conservatorship. I cross-referenced her crude forgeries with my authentic, pristine psychological evaluations, digitally highlighting the discrepancies. Next, I integrated the shadow ledger, extracted from David's mobile phone, detailing his suffocating $1.5 million debt to the violent underground syndicate. I connected that specific debt amount to the off-market real estate contract Naomi had desperately drafted. I highlighted the listed buyer Obsidian Capital Group and attached the complex IP traces mapping their network directly to the known dark money laundering cartel. Then came the heaviest and most lethal blow. I took the offshore financial records linking the syndicate directly to Judge Harrison Montgomery and Thomas Bradley. I mapped the intricate flow of illicit money from the Cayman Islands to the Cyprus shell accounts, and finally to the judge's hidden personal notary trust. The digital web was flawless and undeniable. It showed exactly how the judge actively used his judicial bench to systematically strip assets from vulnerable targeted citizens, transferring high-value real estate into the hands of a violent cartel in exchange for massive personal kickbacks. I encrypted the massive data packet using a localized quantum cipher I had designed myself. It was a digital vault that absolutely nobody else could unlock. I mirrored the master dossier across 3 separate, highly secure offshore servers, ensuring that even if the syndicate managed to physically breach my basement, the evidence would survive and deploy automatically. Mitchell watched the progress bars complete his expression, turning incredibly dangerous. We have absolutely everything, Riley. We have the motive, the financial means, the violent execution, and the systemic corruption at the highest level of the county court. When we walk into that final hearing tomorrow, we are not just defending your property. We are executing a legal decapitation strike on a massive criminal enterprise. But we have one major problem. I looked up from the glowing monitors. Local jurisdiction, I said. Exactly. Mitchell nodded heavily. We cannot simply hand this dossier to the local police when they inevitably arrive to take Naomi's fabricated vandalism report. We cannot trust the county prosecutors because they answer to the exact same corrupt judicial system Judge Montgomery operates in. If we present this irrefutable evidence in that courtroom tomorrow, Montgomery will just strike it from the record again and order his armed bailiffs to arrest us for contempt of court. We need heavy artillery. We need absolute federal authority standing in that room before the judge even touches his gavel. I turned back to my monitors and cleanly closed out the secure network connections. I knew exactly who to call. My time in the military was not just spent writing complex code in dark, windowless rooms. I had served under men and women who commanded absolute tactical authority and demanded absolute unyielding integrity. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a specialized heavy-duty encrypted satellite phone. It looked like a standard, rugged cellular device, but it operated on a highly classified frequency, bouncing signals directly off secure defense satellites to prevent any local law enforcement interception. I powered the device on and entered a complex 16-digit alphanumeric passcode. "Who exactly are you calling?" Mitchell asked, his eyes narrowing with intense curiosity. "The only person on this planet who hates stolen valor and domestic terrorism more than I do," I replied, my thumb hovering over the call button. I dialed a 12-digit international command number and waited in the quiet basement. The secure line rang twice before a sharp, deeply authoritative voice answered on the other end. "State your security clearance and your operational objective," the voice demanded, echoing slightly over the satellite relay. "General, this is Specialist Riley," I said, my voice perfectly steady and commanding. "I am currently operating on domestic soil. I have an active hostile situation involving a highly compromised county judge, a violent organized crime syndicate, and severe federal medical forgery. I am requesting immediate tactical and federal legal intervention." There was a brief, heavy silence on the satellite connection as the encryption protocols stabilized across the relay. General Arthur Vance, a man who had orchestrated multi-theater cyber warfare campaigns from a fortified bunker in Virginia, finally spoke. "Specialist Riley," his voice dropped to a low, dangerous register. "I am looking at your active telemetry data right now. My monitors are showing a complete municipal power failure at your designated coordinates. Confirm your physical status." I am secure, General, I replied, my eyes scanning the infrared feed still looping on my localized monitors. But the structural perimeter has been deliberately compromised. Hostile actors severed the main electrical lines and engaged in a coordinated physical destruction of the primary residential floor. The sound of a heavy sigh echoed over the secure connection. General Vance knew exactly what my estate actually was. When I purchased the sprawling historic home 2 months ago, I did not just buy it for the antique hardwood floors or the sprawling gardens. I bought it because it sat directly on top of a decommissioned Cold War-era telecommunications bunker, using highly classified Department of Defense grants. I had spent the last 8 weeks retrofitting the subterranean levels into a heavily fortified off-site data backup center for naval intelligence and the United States Cyber Command. My family genuinely believed I was just a wealthy veteran splurging on a luxurious suburban sanctuary. They had absolutely no idea that beneath the Italian leather sofas and the custom-stained glass windows sat racks of military-grade servers actively holding redundant quantum encryption keys for the federal government. Who authorized a physical strike on a federal data node? General Vance demanded the operational calm in his voice, masking a rising lethal fury. It is not a foreign intelligence operation, General, I explained, pulling up the master dossier on my screen. It is a domestic racketeering conspiracy, masking itself as a family dispute. My brother and his wife are millions of dollars in debt to a violent underground syndicate. They have manufactured fraudulent psychiatric records and colluded with a highly corrupt county judge named Harrison Montgomery to place me under an emergency conservatorship. Their objective is to legally seize this property tomorrow morning and immediately liquidate it to an offshore shell company called Obsidian Capital Group to clear their debt. General Vance processed the tactical summary in less than 3 seconds. Let me ensure I am understanding this situation perfectly, specialist. A local county judge and a street-level loan shark syndicate are currently attempting to use civil court to forcefully transfer ownership of Sector 7 Alpha to an unverified offshore entity. That is correct, General. And to facilitate this illegal transfer, they hired civilian mercenaries to attack the structure and sever the main power grid to a classified military installation. Yes, sir, I confirmed. The sheer scale of the legal and tactical catastrophe David and Naomi had just triggered was staggering. By cutting the power and breaking the physical perimeter, they had not just committed simple domestic vandalism. They had unknowingly crossed a massive invisible red line. They had executed a direct physical attack on United States government property. Furthermore, by attempting to disrupt a facility actively housing classified military algorithms, they had officially committed an act of federal cyber terrorism. The moment those hired thugs swung a crowbar through my front window, this ceased being a family matter. It became a matter of national security. I am authorizing an immediate tactical response. General Vance stated, his tone shifting into absolute command authority. I am spinning up a specialized Naval Criminal Investigative Service unit, and I will have the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation on a secure line in less than 2 minutes. We are locking down your coordinates. I am dispatching an armed extraction team to secure the servers and neutralize the hostiles. Negative, General, I interjected, my voice cutting sharply through his orders. I am explicitly requesting you hold all tactical units back from this location. Explain yourself, specialist. If you send black tactical vehicles to my house right now, the local police will respond to the commotion, I reasoned. The syndicate will immediately scatter into the shadows. My brother will play the innocent victim, and Judge Montgomery will quietly shred the fraudulent paperwork from the safety of his chambers. We will catch the pawns, but the king will walk away completely untouched. I need you to let this play out exactly according to their fabricated schedule. What is your operational timeline? General Vance asked. Tomorrow morning, Friday, at exactly 0900 hours, I stated, checking the digital clock on my terminal. The final conservatorship hearing is scheduled in Department 47 at the county courthouse. Judge Montgomery plans to officially sign over the deed to my estate right there on the public record. If we hit them before he signs it, is just an attempted conspiracy. But if we wait until he slams his gavel, he will be committing documented federal treason in front of a live gallery. I am requesting that you deploy your NCIS and FBI strike teams directly to the courthouse. General Vance was silent for a long moment, calculating the legal and tactical advantages of the trap I had just laid. You want to let the corrupt judge execute the illegal transfer so we can arrest him for the unauthorized sale of classified military assets. He concluded, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. I want to put every single one of them in a federal cage, General, I replied coldly. I want the judge, the corrupt attorney, the syndicate contacts, and my family all caught in the exact same net. I have a comprehensive digital dossier containing the financial tracing, the recorded audio confessions, and the forged military medical records. I am routing the encrypted package to your secure terminal right now. A soft chime confirmed the upload was successful. I will review this intelligence immediately, General Vance said. You have authorization to proceed with your timeline specialist. The FBI Cyber Task Force and heavily armed NCIS federal agents will be waiting in the shadows of the courthouse tomorrow morning. When you give the signal, we will breach the doors and shut down their entire operation. Maintain your position and do not engage the local authorities. Understood, General, I said. Good hunting, Riley. The satellite connection terminated with a sharp click, leaving the basement in quiet anticipation. I placed the heavy-duty phone back onto the desk and looked over at Mitchell. The former military prosecutor was smiling a terrifying, predatory smile. The trap was no longer just set. It was federally armed and completely inescapable. We had just turned my brother's greedy civil theft into a massive national security operation. Tomorrow morning, Naomi, David, and their corrupt judge were going to walk into Department 47, expecting to steal a historic home. Instead, they were going to walk directly into the devastating teeth of the United States military. Friday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that swept across the concrete plazas of the county courthouse. Mitchell and I drove the perimeter in complete silence, mapping the strategic layout of the building. To the untrained eye, it was just another busy day in the legal district, but I knew the truth. Hidden inside unmarked utility vans and plain sedans, parked strategically around the courthouse block, were heavily armed federal agents from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Task Force. They were invisible, completely integrated into the morning commute, just waiting for my signal. I stepped out of the vehicle and the biting wind caught the edge of my jacket. I was not wearing a civilian suit today. If Judge Montgomery and my family wanted to publicly question my sanity and attack my military service, they were going to have to do it while looking at exactly what I had sacrificed for this country. I was dressed in my formal navy dress blue uniform. The pristine dark fabric was perfectly pressed, the gold buttons gleaming in the dull morning light. On my left breast, positioned prominently above my campaign ribbons, was the Navy Cross. It was the second highest military decoration awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. It was a heavy piece of metal that carried the weight of the lives I had saved and the blood I had shed. Today it was going to serve as a massive psychological weapon. Mitchell walked beside me carrying the same black leather briefcase, but today his posture was different. He was no longer playing the role of a desperate defense attorney, fighting a losing battle. He moved with the calculated, predatory grace of a military executioner walking to the gallows. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors of Department 47 exactly 5 minutes before 9 o'clock. The suffocating silence of the courtroom from the previous day had completely vanished. It had been replaced by an atmosphere of arrogant celebration. My entire family was already there, occupying the front row of the gallery. Naomi, David, Richard, and Patricia sat clustered together, whispering and laughing quietly among themselves. They were not acting like a family forced to commit a loved one to a psychiatric ward. They were acting like lottery winners waiting to cash a multi-million-dollar ticket. When I walked down the center aisle, the crisp sound of my polished dress shoes echoing on the hardwood floor, their laughter died instantly. Naomi turned around, her eyes widening as she took in the formal military uniform and the gleaming Navy cross. For a fraction of a second, genuine fear flashed across her face. She knew she had forged federal documents to claim I was a broken, unhinged liability, and now I was standing in front of her looking like the absolute embodiment of military discipline and undeniable competence. But the fear quickly vanished, replaced by a sickening smirk. She thought the uniform was just a desperate final stunt. She thought the game was already over. My parents did not even make eye contact with me. Richard and Patricia stared straight ahead at the judge's empty bench, completely ignoring my presence. They had already severed me from their lives. In their minds, I was already locked in a padded room, and David was already saved. I sat down at the defense table, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. Mitchell sat beside me, placing his hands flat on the table. We did not speak. Thomas Bradley sat at the petitioner's table directly across the aisle. He was practically vibrating with smug excitement. He wore a ridiculously expensive bespoke suit, likely purchased with the anticipated kickbacks from the dark money syndicate. He opened his leather portfolio and organized a small stack of pristine legal documents, the off-market transfer deeds, the final nails in my coffin. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the tense air. Judge Harrison Montgomery swept into the courtroom, his black robe flowing like a dark shadow. He took his seat at the high bench, adjusting his glasses and immediately zeroing in on my uniform. A flash of intense irritation crossed his wrinkled face. He hated that I was defying the broken veteran narrative they had so carefully constructed. He hated the Navy Cross pinned to my chest. It was a blatant challenge to his corrupt authority. "Let us conclude this unfortunate matter," Judge Montgomery announced, banging his gavel once with excessive force. "We are here for the final ruling on the permanent conservatorship and the immediate asset transfer regarding the respondent. Mr. Bradley, do you have the finalized paperwork?" Thomas Bradley stood up, buttoning his jacket with a theatrical flourish. "Yes, Your Honor. Based on the respondent's complete psychological deterioration and the horrific destruction she caused to her own property last night, we have expedited the transfer documents. The local police have a full report of her violent vandalism, Your Honor. For her own immediate safety and the safety of the public, we are requesting total permanent conservatorship be granted to David and Naomi effectively immediately." Bradley picked up the small stack of papers and practically skipped toward the bench, sliding the final property transfer documents directly to the judge. Montgomery picked up his heavy gold fountain pen, holding it over the signature line. "The court agrees with the petitioners." Judge Montgomery stated, his voice dripping with false legal solemnity. "The destruction of the estate last night proves the respondent is a severe danger. I am prepared to sign the final orders transferring all property rights to the brother and sister-in-law." Before the judge could press the pen to the paper, Naomi suddenly stood up from her seat at the petitioner's table. She could not help herself. Her arrogance and greed completely overrode standard courtroom decorum. She wanted to twist the knife one last time. "Your Honor," Naomi said, her voice a sickeningly sweet whine. "Since you are signing the house over to us right now, we need to secure the premises immediately to prevent her from doing any more damage. I want her to hand over the physical keys to the estate right now, in front of you." The entire courtroom went dead silent. Thomas Bradley smirked. My father nodded in agreement from the gallery. Judge Montgomery looked down at me from his high bench, his pen still hovering over the fraudulent deeds. "The petitioner is entirely within her rights," the judge declared, pointing his pen at me. "You will surrender the keys to the property immediately, or I will have my bailiffs arrest you for contempt and physically search you." I did not reach into my pocket. I did not flinch. I did not say a single word. I simply sat perfectly still in my dress blue uniform, staring dead-eyed directly at Judge Harrison Montgomery. I let the silence stretch out for 5 agonizing seconds, letting their hubris peak to its absolute maximum limit. Mitchell casually reached over and tapped a specific rhythm on his sleek digital watch. It was not a nervous habit. It was the tactical signal. The trap was sprung. Judge Montgomery's heavy gold fountain pen remained suspended in the air, hovering just inches above the fraudulent transfer deeds. My absolute refusal to speak or break eye contact seemed to completely short-circuit his brain. The heavy silence in Department 47 stretched from 5 seconds to 10 and then to 15. The silence in the room became so absolute that I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the antique wooden clock hanging on the far wall. My total stillness was a calculated tactical weapon, and the corrupt judge was walking directly into the blade. He fully expected a broken, traumatized woman to beg for mercy or scream in a paranoid rage, validating the fabricated narrative Naomi had so carefully constructed. My unblinking stoicism actively challenged his supreme authority, and men like Montgomery do not handle public defiance well. The veins in the judge's neck began to visibly bulge against his tight white collar. He slammed his fountain pen down onto his heavy oak desk. The sharp crack echoed through the silent courtroom like a pistol shot. He leaned forward, his face flushing a deep mottled shade of crimson. Thomas Bradley shifted nervously in his expensive bespoke suit, sensing the unpredictable and dangerous shift in the judge's temperament. But he practically salivated at the prospect of the judge breaking my spirit before he collected his massive illegal kickback. Naomi, however, leaned forward with eager, hungry anticipation. "You think you are above the law, young lady judge?" Montgomery spat, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You think you can walk into my courtroom dressed in a formal military uniform expecting me to simply bow down to your supposed service? I have read your psychological profile. I have seen the sworn affidavits. I have read the preliminary police reports detailing the psychotic, violent rampage you went on last night, systematically destroying your own property in a paranoid frenzy." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my breathing slow and even letting his anger build and compound upon itself. He wanted a dramatic reaction, and I was giving him a reinforced stone wall. "Do not look at me with that arrogant expression." Judge Montgomery roared, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Your military service is a complete farce. You are not a disciplined soldier. You are a severely disturbed individual who is entirely unfit to manage her own finances, her own property, or her own life. You are mentally unfit to wear the uniform of the United States Armed Forces in my court of law. It is an insult to this judicial institution and an insult to the citizens you supposedly served." The judge stood up from his heavy leather chair, leaning aggressively over the high bench to maximize his imposing physical figure. He wanted to utterly destroy my spirit right there in front of my family. He wanted to humiliate me so thoroughly that I would never dare to challenge his authority or investigate his dark money syndicate again. He wanted me crying on the floor, completely shattered, before he signed my $2.5 million estate over to a violent cartel. "I will not finalize this property transfer while you sit there making a mockery of this legal proceeding," he barked, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. "I am officially ordering you to strip that uniform of its unearned decorations. Take off that cheap jewelry. You are a danger to society, not a hero." A collective shocked gasp rippled through the few neutral observers sitting in the back rows of the courtroom, but the front row was practically vibrating with cruel, vindictive satisfaction. I shifted my gaze slightly toward the gallery, taking in the faces of the people who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. My father Richard sat with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, a stern expression of absolute approval masking his face. He genuinely believed this public humiliation was the necessary medicine to force me into total compliance. My mother, Patricia, looked down at her purse, refusing to watch the execution, but doing absolutely nothing to intervene. David wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, looking entirely relieved that the judge was handling the dirty work. And then there was Naomi. She could not contain her malicious glee. She slowly reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her latest model smartphone. Holding it low against the wooden gallery partition, she angled the high-definition camera lens directly at my face. The small red recording light blinked subtly in the dim courtroom lighting. She was capturing this moment to watch later. She wanted a digital trophy of my absolute lowest moment. She wanted a video of the highly decorated military veteran being stripped of her honor by a county judge so she could laugh at it while counting the illicit money from the sale of my house. She smirked at me, a sickening twisting of her lips that radiated pure, unadulterated greed. I looked down at the Navy Cross pinned precisely to my dark blue uniform. It was not cheap jewelry. It was forged in the fire of a classified overseas operation where I had pulled 3 wounded teammates from a burning communication bunker while under heavy enemy fire. It represented sacrifice duty and an unbreakable oath to protect the innocent from exactly the kind of domestic predators currently sitting in this room. Beside me, Mitchell did not object. He did not stand up and shout about my constitutional rights. He did not cite legal precedent regarding the utter disrespect the judge was showing to a federally awarded combat medal. A standard civilian defense attorney would have been screaming objection at the top of their lungs, but Mitchell was not a standard attorney. He was a former military prosecutor who had just sent a synchronized tactical signal to a heavily armed federal strike team waiting right outside the doors. Mitchell slowly pushed his heavy wooden chair back, bringing it a few inches away from the defense table. He stood up, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his tailored suit jacket, and took a single deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between himself and me. He crossed his arms and looked up at Judge Montgomery with an expression of cold, terrifying pity. Mitchell knew exactly what was about to happen. I knew that by explicitly ordering a decorated service member to remove a federally issued medal in a court of law, the judge had not just demonstrated gross bias. He had crossed a line that the United States military does not forgive. He had given the federal agents waiting outside the absolute perfect justification to breach the room. The judge had demanded I surrender my honor, and in doing so, he had sealed his own ultimate destruction. I kept my eyes locked on Judge Montgomery as the echoes of his tyrannical order faded into the heavy air of the courtroom. He stood leaning aggressively over the high mahogany bench, his face flushed with the intoxicating power of absolute authority. He was a man accustomed to total submission and unquestioned obedience. He fully expected me to break down crying to beg for my dignity, or to scream in a fit of rage that would perfectly validate his fraudulent psychiatric hold. Instead, I gave him nothing but cold, terrifying compliance. I raised my right hand, slowly bringing it up to my chest. The movement was so deliberate and controlled that Thomas Bradley actually flinched in his chair, expecting me to draw a concealed weapon. In the gallery behind me, I could hear the sharp intake of breath from my mother. She was finally witnessing the ultimate public humiliation of her daughter, the final crushing blow that would theoretically save her golden boy from the consequences of his own massive failures. Naomi shifted her smartphone, adjusting the camera angle to ensure she captured every single agonizing second of my supposed defeat in pristine high definition. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of the Navy Cross. It was secured to my dark blue uniform fabric by a specialized military clasp. I did not hesitate. I did not let a single ounce of emotion betray the lethal trap I was currently springing. I gripped the edges of the metal and smoothly unpinned it from my chest. The heavy bronze cross, attached to its navy blue and white ribbon, felt entirely different in my hand than it did pinned proudly over my heart. It felt heavy and dense, like a specialized piece of ordnance waiting to be deployed. I lowered my hand, holding the metal loosely by my side. I stepped out from behind the heavy oak defense table. My polished black dress shoes struck the hardwood floor with a sharp, rhythmic cadence that sounded distinctly like a military march. I did not walk toward the exit. I walked straight down the center aisle, moving directly toward the petitioner's table where my brother and his treacherous wife sat completely paralyzed by my absolute lack of emotional breakdown. David swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as I approached. He could not look me in the eye. He stared down at his hands, twisting his wedding ring with frantic, desperate energy. Naomi, on the other hand, kept her phone raised, the red recording light blinking steadily in the dim courtroom lighting. She was completely oblivious to the danger, mistaking my tactical silence for absolute surrender. She offered me a sickening, victorious smile, convinced she had just won a $2.5 million estate and completely destroyed my life in the process. Thomas Bradley sat beside them, practically vibrating with greed, already calculating his massive 20% commission fee for facilitating the illegal sale. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from their table, directly in front of the elevated judicial bench. Judge Montgomery watched me with a look of supreme, smug satisfaction. He slowly sat back down in his high-backed leather chair, believing he had successfully broken a highly decorated federal asset in front of a live audience. He reached out, adjusting his heavy gold fountain pen, preparing to finalize the fraudulent real estate transfer that would line his offshore accounts with illicit syndicate money. I raised my right hand, holding the Navy Cross out over the center of the solid wooden table that separated the petitioners from the judge. The entire courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for me to speak, waiting for me to apologize or plead for mercy. I simply opened my hand. The heavy bronze medal dropped. It struck the thick mahogany table with a sharp, echoing clack that resonated violently through the dead silence of the courtroom. The sound was incredibly loud, slicing through the tension like a physical blade. The metal bounced once before settling completely still against the polished wood, the navy blue ribbon sprawling out like a dark stain across the legal documents. I looked up from the table and stared directly into Judge Montgomery's eyes. I still did not speak. The absolute silence of my compliance was infinitely more terrifying than any threat I could have screamed. Judge Montgomery sneered, looking down at the discarded decoration with total disgust. "A wise decision, young lady," he stated, his voice booming through the judicial microphone. "You have finally realized that your delusions of grandeur hold absolutely no weight in my courtroom. This court finds the respondent completely unfit to manage her own affairs. The emergency conservatorship is hereby made permanent. All property deeds, financial assets, and legal rights are immediately transferred to David and Naomi." He reached blindly to his right, his fingers wrapping around the polished wooden handle of his heavy judicial gavel. He raised it high into the air, preparing to strike the sounding block and permanently seal my fate. He had absolutely no idea that the sharp metallic clack of the Navy Cross hitting the mahogany table was not just a sound of surrender. It was a highly calibrated acoustic trigger, sewn directly into the thick fabric collar of my dress blue uniform. Just below my jawline was a micro-acoustic transmitter linked to the Secure Defense Satellite Network. It was an open microphone actively monitored by General Vance and the Joint Federal Task Force waiting outside. They were not waiting for a verbal command. They were waiting for a specific decibel spike. The distinct metallic frequency of solid bronze striking hardwood was the prearranged execution signal. When that metal hit the table, the acoustic spike transmitted instantly to the tactical earpieces of 30 heavily armed federal agents currently stacked in the hallway right outside the heavy double doors of Department 47. Judge Montgomery swung his gavel down toward the block, his face twisted into a mask of pure, greedy triumph. Naomi leaned forward, her eyes wide with total victory. David finally exhaled a massive breath of relief, believing the violent loan shark syndicate was finally paid off. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the countdown had already hit 0. The trap was triggered. The hammer was falling, but it was not the judge's wooden gavel that was about to strike. It was the full devastating weight of the United States government. Before the wooden gavel could make contact with the sounding block, a deafening crash shattered the absolute silence of Department 47. The heavy, solid oak double doors at the back of the courtroom did not simply open. They were violently kicked inward with such explosive kinetic force that the metal hinges shrieked and splintered wood rained down onto the polished floor. Federal agents do not knock when executing a high-level national security breach. A tidal wave of black tactical gear, Kevlar vests, and matte black assault rifles flooded into the room. Over 30 heavily armed operators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Cyber Task Force, and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service poured through the entrance, moving with terrifying synchronized precision. They instantly established a hard perimeter, locking down every single exit window and blind spot within 3 seconds. "Federal agents, remain where you are," a voice roared over a mechanized bullhorn, vibrating the antique light fixtures hanging from the ceiling. "Keep your hands visible and away from your pockets. Any sudden movement will be considered a hostile threat." The sheer scale of the physical breach instantly paralyzed everyone in the room. The transition from a quiet, corrupt civil proceeding to an active federal tactical zone was so jarring that human brains simply failed to process it. My mother, Patricia, let out a sharp, piercing scream of pure visceral terror, dropping her designer purse to the floor. My father, Richard, froze, completely rigid, his face draining of all color as 4 red laser sights immediately tracked across his chest, pinning him to his seat. David practically collapsed into his chair, throwing his hands high into the air and whimpering like a beaten dog, his pathetic facade of control instantly evaporating. Thomas Bradley, the smug, corrupt attorney, slowly raised his manicured hands, his expensive bespoke suit suddenly looking like a very cheap burial shroud, as 2 federal agents flanked his table with their rifles drawn and leveled directly at his head. Judge Harrison Montgomery stood frozen behind his high bench. His gavel remained suspended mid-air, his arm locked in a state of absolute shock. He stared at the sea of federal tactical operators, completely unable to comprehend how his private, localized civil court had just been violently hijacked by the United States military apparatus. "What is the meaning of this, Judge?" Montgomery finally sputtered, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "I demand an explanation right now. I am a sitting county judge, and this is a localized civil matter. I order you to stand down immediately." The tactical operators did not even flinch. They held their positions absolutely silent, waiting for the designated federal authority to take the floor. Mitchell, my attorney, calmly adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket and picked up his black leather briefcase. The fragile illusion of the desperate, struggling defense lawyer vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating presence of a senior military prosecutor who had just cornered his prey. He walked with slow, deliberate steps straight up to the elevated judicial bench, bypassing the armed agents who parted seamlessly to let him pass. Mitchell unclasped his briefcase. He did not pull out local property codes, standard medical affidavits, or psychiatric evaluations. He pulled out a massive stack of unsealed federal indictments, each one bearing the heavy embossed seal of the United States Department of Justice and the Department of Defense. "This is no longer a civil matter," Harrison Mitchell stated, his voice echoing clearly across the dead-silent courtroom. He dropped the massive stack of federal warrants directly onto the polished mahogany of the judge's bench. The heavy thud sounded exactly like the closing of a coffin lid. Mitchell leaned forward, bracing his hands against the wood and looking directly into the eyes of the terrified judge. "My client did not come here today to defend her property rights. She came here to facilitate a coordinated federal sting operation targeting a domestic racketeering syndicate operating out of this very courthouse." Judge Montgomery looked down at the federal seals on the documents, and his breathing became erratic. Thomas Bradley began to shake violently at the petitioner's table, desperately whispering legal statutes to himself as the horrific reality of his situation set in. "You are currently named as the primary target in a 72-point federal indictment." Mitchell continued, his voice projecting perfectly so that every single person in the gallery, including my horrified parents, could hear every single word. "We have successfully tracked over $40 million in illegal localized property seizures routed directly through your courtroom and funneled into an offshore shell entity known as Obsidian Capital Group. We have the encrypted digital ledger. We have the wire transfer receipts. We have the audio recordings of your backdoor negotiations with Mr. Bradley." "That is an absurd fabrication," Montgomery choked out desperately, looking around the room for a way out that did not exist. "You have absolutely no jurisdiction here." "I have complete federal jurisdiction," Mitchell countered, his tone turning ice cold and razor sharp, "because last night you and the petitioners authorized a physical breach on my client's estate to manufacture fraudulent evidence for this hearing. You hired civilian mercenaries to sever the municipal power grid and physically attack the structural perimeter. You thought you were vandalizing a residential home to force an emergency psychiatric hold." Mitchell turned slowly, sweeping his gaze across David and Naomi, who were trembling violently at their table. He wanted them to hear exactly how they had destroyed their own lives. "You did not vandalize a residential home." Mitchell announced, the devastating truth finally landing like a physical blow. "My client's estate is a federally contracted, highly classified off-site data backup center for the Department of Defense. It actively houses redundant quantum encryption keys for the United States Cyber Command. By authorizing a physical strike on that location and attempting to disrupt the power grid, you officially committed a coordinated act of federal cyber terrorism." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Cyber terrorism. It was a charge that carried a mandatory minimum sentence measured in decades, not months. It was a charge that guaranteed a life spent inside a maximum security federal facility. Judge Harrison Montgomery stared at the indictments, the blood draining entirely from his face, until his skin took on a sickening, ghostly pallor. His knees gave out, and he collapsed back into his heavy leather chair, the wooden gavel slipping from his grasp and clattering harmlessly to the floor. Two massive federal agents immediately ascended the steps to the high bench, flanking the judge on both sides. Without speaking a single word, they grabbed his arms, forcefully pulling them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, locking around his wrists, echoed through the judicial microphone, broadcasting his absolute downfall to the entire room. At the petitioner's table, Naomi stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant, vindictive smirk that had defined her entire existence was completely wiped away, replaced by a hollow, gaping expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Her lungs hitched, unable to pull in oxygen. She realized with crushing finality that she was not walking out of this courtroom with a multi-million-dollar estate. She was walking out in chains. The realization broke her mind entirely. Her fingers went totally numb, and the latest model smartphone she had been using to record my supposed humiliation slipped from her grasp. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, the screen shattering into 100 jagged pieces, mirroring the complete and utter destruction of her life. The shattered glass from Naomi's phone crunched violently beneath the heavy tactical boot of an approaching federal agent. The sharp sound snapped her out of her catatonic shock, and the horrifying reality of the situation finally crashed down upon her. As two massive NCIS operators grabbed her arms to haul her out of her chair, she began to thrash wildly. Her designer handbag spilled across the petitioner table, scattering expensive cosmetics and the fraudulent property transfer deeds onto the floor. "You cannot do this to me!" Naomi shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, piercing wail. "We did not know it was a classified military site. We just wanted the house. We just wanted the money to pay off the debt. David, tell them. Tell them it was just a family dispute." But David was completely incapable of forming a coherent sentence. My golden brother, the man who had confidently orchestrated a malicious psychiatric hold against me just 24 hours ago, was now a sobbing, hyperventilating mess on the floor. An FBI agent had him pinned firmly against the hardwood, sharply pulling his arms behind his back to secure thick, heavy-duty plastic zip ties around his wrists. David wept openly, snot and tears streaming down his face as he choked on his own panicked, shallow breaths. "Please," he sobbed frantically, looking around the chaotic room for anyone to save him. "I am a victim here. The syndicate made me do it. They threatened my life." "Save your breath for the federal prosecutor," Mitchell said, looking down at my pathetic brother with a mask of absolute disgust. "The violent loan sharks you are so terrified of are currently being raided by a joint FBI SWAT team at a commercial warehouse across town. Obsidian Capital Group is being entirely dismantled as we speak. They will no longer be an issue for you, David, but the federal government will. You are facing mandatory minimum sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary for domestic cyber terrorism and the attempted theft of classified military assets." The tactical agents hauled David and Naomi to their feet. They kicked and screamed, begging for a mercy that simply did not exist. They were forcefully dragged down the center aisle of the courtroom, their hysterical, desperate cries echoing off the high wood-paneled ceilings as they were paraded out the heavy double doors and loaded directly into waiting armored transport vehicles. Thomas Bradley was next. Frog marched out in his extremely expensive bespoke suit, his legal career, his massive wealth, and his freedom entirely destroyed in a matter of minutes. With the primary targets removed, the federal agents began securing the perimeter, leaving a suffocating heavy vacuum in the center of the courtroom. Mitchell gave me a brief, respectful nod before stepping away to coordinate the evidence extraction with General Vance over an encrypted satellite channel. I was left standing completely alone in front of the elevated judicial bench. The only other civilians remaining in the gallery were my parents. Richard and Patricia were not in handcuffs. They had not physically signed the fraudulent transfer deeds or financially hired the civilian mercenaries. Legally speaking, they were clear of the federal indictments. But as they stood in the ruins of Department 47, surrounded by shattered wood and heavily armed federal agents, they looked entirely destroyed. Their pristine suburban reputation, their country club status, and their carefully constructed illusion of a perfect, flawless family were completely obliterated. The local news would have a field day with the arrest of the county judge and their golden son. Patricia stumbled forward, clutching the wooden railing of the gallery partition to keep herself upright. Her face was streaked with running mascara and her hands trembled violently. Riley, she gasped out, her voice completely broken and raspy. Riley, please, you have to stop this right now. You have to call off these federal agents. He is your brother. He made a terrible, horrific mistake, but he is your family. He will not survive in a federal prison. Please, Riley, you have enough money. You can afford to let this go. My father stepped up beside her, his usual stern, authoritative demeanor completely shattered into pieces. He looked old, frail, and entirely defeated by the weight of his own massive failures as a parent. Riley, he pleaded, his voice thick with desperate, choking tears. We are begging you. Do not destroy your brother's life. We can fix this privately as a family. Just tell the military it was a massive misunderstanding. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world. The two people who had stood idly by while I was painted as a psychotic, violent danger to society. They had watched their son try to steal my estate, my finances, and my freedom, and they had offered him their full unconditional support. They had been perfectly willing to let me rot in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life, as long as David got his massive debt paid off. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel sorrow or betrayal or grief. I felt absolutely nothing for them. They were complete strangers to me now. I turned my attention away from their weeping faces and looked down at the heavy mahogany table. I reached out and picked up the Navy Cross. The solid bronze metal was cold and heavy against my fingers. I raised it to my chest, and with slow, deliberate precision, I pinned the combat medal back onto my pristine dress blue uniform. I secured the specialized military clasp, ensuring the navy blue and white ribbon sat perfectly straight over my heart. I looked my parents dead in the eyes. My posture was perfectly rigid, my expression completely devoid of any sympathy. My voice was calm, cold, and completely hollow. You chose your golden child. I stated the words, slicing through their desperate sobbing like a surgical blade. Now watch him tarnish. I did not wait for their response. I did not need to hear another pathetic excuse or another desperate plea for unearned forgiveness. I turned my back on them and walked away. My polished black dress shoes struck the hardwood floor with a steady, rhythmic cadence matching the powerful beat of my own heart. I walked past the shattered wooden doors, past the remaining federal tactical operators, securing the busy hallway, and out into the main marble lobby of the county courthouse. I pushed through the massive glass exit doors and stepped out onto the concrete plaza. The cold, biting wind of the early morning had completely vanished, replaced by the bright, warming rays of the midday sun. I took a deep, long breath. The crisp, fresh air filled my lungs completely. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had anchored me to this toxic, deceitful family for my entire life was finally gone. I had not just defeated them in a court of law. I had completely eradicated their toxic influence over my existence. I was a highly decorated combat veteran, a covert intelligence operative, and a self-made millionaire. I was walking out of that building completely free from their shadow, and entirely back in control of my life and my expanding empire. Sometimes the only way to beat a toxic family is to let them dig their own graves. Have you ever had to cut off relatives who tried to destroy you? Let me know in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of ultimate justice. One of the most profound lessons embedded in this narrative is the realization that the most devastating response to toxic behavior is rarely a loud emotional argument, but rather a silent strategic boundary. When faced with malicious family members and corrupt authority figures who fully expected her to crumble or react with blind rage, Riley chose a completely different path. She allowed her adversaries to operate safely under their own arrogant assumptions. In a modern environment where emotional reactions are constantly provoked by those who wish to manipulate us, this story serves as a powerful masterclass in stoicism and calculated self-control. The antagonistic forces of Naomi David and Judge Montgomery were entirely fueled by their own unbridled greed and hubris. They desperately relied on Riley to play the designated role of the hysterical, broken victim. By refusing to engage in their chaotic, theatrical disputes, Riley deprived them of the very emotional ammunition they needed to succeed. Instead, she meticulously gathered undeniable evidence and constructed an inescapable consequence for their illegal actions. This approach highlights a critical truth about dealing with profound betrayal, especially from within a close family structure. You simply cannot argue a deeply toxic person into suddenly developing genuine empathy or a functional moral compass. Engaging in their emotional warfare only drags you down into their fabricated reality. The ultimate victory lies in stepping completely outside of their game and securing your own independent foundation. Riley did not just defeat her treacherous relatives, she outgrew them completely, rendering their toxic influence entirely powerless against her established empire and unshakable discipline. True justice often does not require exhausting screaming matches, because true justice simply requires letting the guilty dig their own inescapable graves. Share this empowering reflection with someone who needs the strength to walk away from toxic relationships and reclaim their absolute independence today.